Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, everyone. This is Mu'taz Zahir from Maqasid Institute. I'd like to thank you for your joining and participate in this course or intensive course. And I would like to thank Dr. Jasser for his time, and we pray and ask God to have useful time and fruitful ilm, inshallah. I don't want to go deeply and take a long time in a briefing, but I would like to remember you that we have four sessions with the same time from 8 a.m. to 11 a.m. in Toronto time. And all of you, we share with you all the book, the Maqasid methodology, and it's confidential. So we would like to be sure that not to share this draft with anyone else. And I give the floor to Dr. Jasser. He could manage the session as he wants.
As he wants. Allah يكرمك. جزاك الله خير دكتور معتز. Allah bless you أخي. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله حمدا كثيرا طيبا مباركا فيه مباركا عليه كما يحب ربنا ويرضى. وكما ينبغي لجلال وجهه وعظيم سلطانه، والصلاة والسلام على أسعد خلقه وخاتم رسله محمد صلى الله عليه وآله، ورضي الله عن المهاجرين والأنصار ومن تبعهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين. ثم أما بعد. It's such a pleasure to be back, and it is such a big project. As usual, your brother gets himself in things that are bigger than his ability. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala helps. And perhaps this is the nature of things, that when we are weak and we realize our weakness, we are weak anyway. خُلِقَ الْإِنسَانُ ضَعِيفًا. The human is created weak. But perhaps when we realize our weakness, that's when we perhaps make some success. When we, rely on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala only. This is a huge topic, not because of my ideas are simple, because of the magnitude of the subject. It's not the approach. The approach is very humble. And again, it's a weak human approach. Inshallah, it is advanced. And it is based on, I can say now, decades. I'm old enough to say decades, or even, I know, I can speak in the century terms as well, like half a century of a journey with the Quran and the Sunnah of Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam. Yet it's the magnitude because of the subject itself. The subject is the message of the divine. I mean, speaking English again, it's funny, but يعني الرسالة الإلهية, the mission, message, task of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that he gave humanity. The Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, Muhammad, grew up in Mecca, worshipping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala based on the Aqidah or the basic creed of Ibrahim, one of his great-great-grandfathers. And he was sitting in a cave that he used to go to for weeks at a time to worship. Worship Allah. He didn't know details more than that, other than worshiping Allah, the Lord of the Kaaba. He never prostrated to one of those idols, whether the stone idols or the human idols that people had in Mecca. And he, sallallahu alayhi wasallam, was sitting when an angel came to him, and you know the story. And the angel told him, read. This is the most important event in human history. But people don't know. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala eventually in the same book said, but most people don't know. And most people are not aware, and most people are not going to believe you, Muhammad. And most people are not going to be thankful to Allah and so forth. So regardless of what most people think, the internet and connectivity is messing up the assessment of value in human perceptions. So regardless of the most people democratic kind of thing, truth is not a democratic practice. But he, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, received the most important message in human history. And that message is not just a religion, speaking English, this religio kind of sacred constraint, whatever Latin word. It is a deen. A deen is not religion. Deen is an alliance, a way of life, a dedication, a vision, a path. It's many things. It's dana yadinu. It's to align yourself and to lean on something and rely on something, lean towards something, and so forth. That deen is not just a matter of creed, and it is like just to know Allah and then that's it. The universe goes on. And it is not a matter of rituals only. Actually, rituals are in that deen means to an end. They are not really end in their own right. They are meant to be training for something bigger. And it is not law in the sense of a state and a court or whatever. It's not really how the deen is. Law could be part of it, but I mean, if the society really wants to take this deen in a legal sense and apply it in some legal norms where the government uses some force to impose, this is not what the deen is about. The deen is a tasawwur in Arabic, worldview in English, Fulton, Chang, whatever. It's not, this is new in English. In Arabic, a tasawwur is from day one. Like how do you, في أي صورة ما شاء ركبك, in whatever form, how do you define things? So that تصور, we have in the أصول الحكم على الشيء فرع عن تصوره, to judge something depends on how you perceive it, how you conceptualize it, how do you cognize, how do you judge things, what is important and what is not in the world. And just put the charger on. So this is the most important message that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala brought humanity through Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Eventually, it was compiled into a book. Actually, during the time of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, I mean, of course, there is a history of the copy that we have. But during the time of the Prophet ﷺ, this was written and compiled and documented very well. And a number of people memorized it. And in that particular worldview or particular culture, memorization is more authentic than writing, because it really depended on the memorizer. بل هو آيات بينات في صدور الذين أوتوا العلم. Allah is saying that the Quran, بل means, to leave what's before, and this is the truth. بل, but بل is much stronger. بل هو آيات بينات. It's not really a written book, and it's not whatever you are arguing about. It is آيات بينات, آيات, signs, proofs. Of course, in English translated as verses, which is really biblical, but it's like ayat. It is signs, it is but signs in the chests, في صدور الذين أوتوا العلم, in the chests of those who gained knowledge. And therefore, this is, the message is something in the chest something in the heart that you memorize at the very basic level, but that you comprehend and have fiqh in it at the very top level. Fiqh. Fiqh is not law. Fiqh is a deep understanding and leadership. So what we are dealing with today is a different tasawwur, really, of Islam than the original one, than the message that the angel brought to Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Deen is defined differently, fiqh is defined differently, and ayat are defined differently. And once we start to define things according to the Quran and the manifestation of the Quran in a person, Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, Sunnah, then we have a different worldview, a different way of looking at the universe. And if we're going to talk history, in the Islamic civilization, whenever they defined fiqh and ilm and deen and ayat properly, they were at a higher level of what we call civilization in English, or in Arabic, they translated it as hadara, and Islamic as Imran. But it's really more than Imran. It's ibadah. It's ibadah. It's how do we worship Allah? How do we live worshiping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? So that when they defined ayat as particular verses in the Quran only that we are going to read and bring law from, based on a number of people that are called fuqaha, and those fuqaha form, political parties that fight and have weapons enough to fight for power and ally with the violence forces of the time, whatever sultans or amirs or wali of the time, and then they fight with each other over. When ayat was this and fiqh was that and fuqaha was this, we were at the lowest points of our Islamic civilization. And that is what many people are trying to take us to, knowingly or not knowingly. They might not be aware of what Islam is really. Many people, I'm talking about those who preach Islam and those who really write and carry the flag of Islamic scholarship. When they define verses as something written that we dispute over and make parties over interpreting, and we define signs that way, there is no signs in the universe. The universe is just neutral. And we define fiqh as law, and therefore courts or state or this kind of thing. And we define deen as an internal divine theology restriction, whatever the religio of Latin means. Then the way of life, the civilization, the existence of the Muslim ummah or the community is actually a very weak existence, and therefore a very defeated existence. Defeated from what? From the forces of falsehood. Because if we have the right perception, we will know that the history of this world is an alternation between times of dominance of truth, the minority of time, the minority of regions, and the dominance of falsehood in many forms, just to be black and white, but it's of course much more complex than that. But when we define Islam that way, then as Muslims, we are weak and we are not contributing anything. We are just copying from others who have, better means, and follow the sunnah, the universal laws of Allah better. But when we go back to fiqh, as in as in the understanding, the deep understanding of the deen in the wider sense of the word, and the deeper convictions, and therefore the comprehensive approach, then we are dealing with a different religion here, if you wish. So what most Muslims live today is not really the religion of Islam that this tasawwur, that this comprehensive worldview brings. It's not. They don't define things as Islam wanted them to define. They don't have the right purposes that Islam wanted them to have. They don't have the understanding of how the universe functions and what are humans, who are we, and what are we made of, and where are we going, and what are animals, and what is the environment, and what are these stars in the sky, and what is this plant coming out of the earth. There is a different perception of all of these things, let alone what is taqwa and deen and fiqh and ilm and hukm and you name it, on and on, of the 17,000, let's say, words that are in that book that are going to shape that worldview. So a very long introduction to the preface of that book that you have, that has to do with the basically how we envision a restructuring, a re-envisioning of Islamic scholarship. It's not an academic exercise. It's really an exercise of trying to bring Islam back to life for a group of believers that really believe in Islam, the original Islam. Those who do not have knowledge to be educated, and those who perhaps have different objectives than the truth, perhaps if they wish to redefine their objectives. So I have a presentation as a kind of very, let's say, high-level short survey of the book. And then from that, I'm going to get into some small details, because the details, all of what I said, but perhaps the details, then we can exchange some deeper ideas. I think I can share the screen. And this is what I need. Do you see my screen?
Yeah, it's clear.
Alhamdulillah. So basically, this is what you're saying here, re-envisioning Islamic scholarship. And as I mentioned, this is not just about Islamic scholarship. It's rather something that the research is the beginning of a change on the ground. That's how ideas, we are in the business of ideas here. So re-envisioning Islamic scholarship. Now, this is what I was talking about. Al-Wahi is the revelation that came to Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. This is the most important source of knowledge, or it is the only true, if you wish, source of knowledge that we have. We could have knowledge from experimentation, but then we realize that our knowledge that we build based on the experimental logic is always subject to change and subject to development. We discover, the laws of causality and so on, and then we realize that they're not enough to describe the reality. And then we discover, what they call the Newtonian laws, and then we realize that Newton is not enough to even describe basic movement of objects and stuff. And then we discover relativity as if relativity is something real and something factual. And then it turns out to be not factual, because we are discovering more things that go against some of the basic premises of the relativity. The relativity theories are great, but some of them are not correct. Why? Because there is something in the horizons that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said He will show us the ayat in the horizons, something in the horizons of astronomy, or the horizons of the earth, or the horizons even of the atom, that we discover and we realize that our knowledge that is based on experiment and math and all of the good logical stuff, we realize that this is good but not complete. It's useful to create a few machines, but not useful to understand the universe. And therefore, al-wahi here, and then we have quantum physics, and so forth. Al-wahi is the only source of truthful information, and that is the first piece of that worldview. Does it have information on all of this stuff, atoms and stars and trees and animals? Yes, but it has the information on a level that is suitable for the mission of al-wahi. It orients our basic questions and our approach, but it doesn't necessarily answer every question about something goes wrong in your car, or an antenna that's not working, or something that you don't know how to plant or to eat. It doesn't answer this, but it answers the approach to this, so that we continue to develop and eat and travel and look at the universe in a way that is that has an objective, that takes us towards the ibadah, the worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And again, ibadah is distorted quite a bit. Ibadah is to act on earth differently, and to have a different kind of individual, and a different kind of family, and a different kind of community, and a different kind of state, and a different kind of economy. Ibadah, that's ibadah. It's not to have a constitution that says that Islam is the religion of the state and all of this, media stuff. It's actually how we live, not a constitutional reform or some laws that are tied to so many factors. Ibadah. طيب. So fiqh in that sense, and fuqaha, the Prophet ﷺ might have read this in the introduction, when he said that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has sent him with knowledge that is like water that's falling from the sky. And we have two pieces of land, a fertile piece and a sandy piece. The fertile piece, part of it took the water and gave us fruits and vegetation. And the other part kept the water for other people to take. So this is like people who are fuqaha, who understand. He actually said that. He said, فَذَلِكَ مَثَلُ مَنْ فَقِهَ فِي دِينِ اللَّهِ. This guy who brought fruit and plants, this is like those who are fuqaha. You take the water and you issue fruits of knowledge. And the sandy piece of land are the people who are not really fuqaha. And perhaps the small piece of land of the fertile land that kept the water is the huffaz, perhaps the memorizers, people who memorize. That is first degree of knowledge, perhaps. Ayat and deen. So basically, in order to make something out of this that could be memorized, from my experience in the Quran, memorization is not wrong, pedagogically speaking. When you memorize something, you internalize it. When I was a kid and started to memorize the Quran, I didn't understand most of it. I spoke Arabic, but that Egyptian Arabic is really far, and almost every other Arabic is really far from the terminology of the Quran. التقوى هدى للمتقين الذين يؤمنون بالغيب ويقيمون الصلاة ومما رزقناهم ينفقون. What is this? Arabs don't speak like that. You know, they might use the word rizq or whatever the word, but really in a very different sense. So when I memorized, I didn't really understand, but I think it was a very important pedagogical step in trying to connect, and this is the first page of the introduction in your book, the sunnah of connectivity, sunnah at-tawasul. I memorized something, so it's somewhere in my brain or my heart. If we're gonna speak Quranic, it's somewhere in my heart. My brain is just a tool that deals with the heart. But anyway, so it's somewhere in my heart. And when I see something, it triggers that ayah or that hadith. Hadith is different, mostly by meaning. Long story, we will talk about it. But ayat are different. They really, the memorization brings the different fragments of reality that you see and places them somewhere in your heart, so that after some time you start to connect. And of course, I'm not comparing this stuff that I'm writing with the Quran, but I am saying that the memorization of certain elements, I'm just trying to play the memorization of certain elements would, inshallah, be part of that fiqh that you would have in that knowledge of maqasid. So memorization in the Quranic sense, the language is made easy and it rhymes and it speaks to something very deep in the fitrah, in the original nature, because you use certain sounds, and these sounds are not just for the Arabs. They are very ancient. I believe that the pre-Arabic language, or the what's called the Syrianiya, the Prophet ﷺ spoke about Adam speaking Syrianic. Allah Akbar. I'm not saying Syria, I'm saying Syrianiya. So the Prophet ﷺ spoke about Syrianiya being the language of Adam, and then Ismail spoke Arabic. He said, I believe that Arabic is the first child of the most ancient language, and there are elements in it that is the most ancient. I believe in this kind of research based on al-Wahi, and also based on looking into the history of linguistics and how politics shape it. And that's part of the reform that we're calling for here. So basically, the Arabic gives you sounds related to the meaning. So, and this is part of the fitrah, part of what is built in. It's, if you read the Quran and you look at the human bodies, you will see that the Quran is universalizing certain things. It says that if you raise your cheek to people, then you are really being arrogant. And if you lower your wing or bow, then you are humble. And if the Quran is talking about a body language that is natural. And in addition to the cultural stuff that people say, oh, this is that, and this is that, and whatever. But, and the sounds is part of this. And that's the genius of the Arabic language, because qa is for qata'a, qarama, qadama, qa. It has something to do with cutting something. Versus this is, water flowing, something wide, sama, al-sahab, al-sukun, versus, and so forth. Yeah, we'll get to that too. But basically, my point is that memorization programs your faculties based on the language, which speaks to the fitra, to the original nature of the human reaction to sounds and the human perception of realities around us based on words. So that's why Arabic is very natural in that sense, original Arabic anyway, of the Quran. So in that sense, I thought that the memorization perhaps could allow us to connect some parts of that complex kind of proposal that we're making here that has to do with how to understand the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. This is the Arabic. Forgive me for that. Okay, so basically, I want to stop and start some discussion before I come back. But basically, let us summarize what's in that book, the ideas in those trios and 5 steps and 7 elements and this kind of thing. Going by that, just because 7 is a number to remember. And yes, there will be other elements that will fall under the 7, but let's say that the 7 will give us a good approximation from my experience and the experience of the researchers who have been sharing this and working on it. Dr. Basma, primarily, Ustad Hiba, Dr. Zaid, everybody was here, mashallah. 5 elements, 7 elements, 5 steps, fundamental trios, etc. So these things, just to remember, it doesn't mean that they're final. And I'm hoping that this remembrance, when they are tied to the original meanings of these things, then we start to build a basic framework of scholarship that will allow us to redefine Islamic scholarship. Who are we to redefine the Islamic scholarship? We are people who live with that scholarship and try to contribute something, the time of which is up to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. People could come 100 years after and say that this was a very bad idea, or they could come 100 years after, which is what we pray Allah for, and say that this is good, we need that. The old structures are gone. Let's look for new structures for human thought. And it's not sustainable. The current structures of thought and of organization are not sustainable from my perspective, cut a long story short. And therefore, this is a fresh, liberating, to be speaking in English, emancipating kind of view that is based on the original revelation, but that tries to abstract that vast sea of knowledge into a few land posts, or sea posts, if you wish, that would allow us to perhaps have an approach. We're talking about 1, which is the connectivity, holism, emergence. This is the number 1 here, which is Tawheed. And hence we have this complex network of meanings and ayat and ahadith and concepts and objectives and values and commands. But this is 1 at the end. Allah says that we created all of you and we'll bring you back as one soul. So this is the oneness. And then we have 5 limitations of contemporary approaches: taqlid, wa tajzi', wa tabrir, wa tanaqud, wa tafkik. We'll talk about that. And then we have those fundamental trios, if you wish. Why maqasid? Because of its future and critical and comprehensive orientations. Reorienting the Islamic worldview based on these knowledge, reality, and scholarship that is the application of knowledge to reality. Knowledge is also source, logic, and conceptualizations. And reality is history, present, and future. Scholarship is scope and the scholar and the outcome. And methodology is those 5 steps of purpose, cycles of reflection, framework, critical studies of literature and reality, and formative theories and principles, all interconnected, all in a web. The composite framework is basically cycles of reflection to discover the framework, overlaps and connections in the framework, and then the discovery of the elements themselves. When we discover the elements, we get into these 7 elements and how they describe the reality and history and medicine and law and an approach to life, and therefore, in our case as Maqasid Institute, an approach to Islamic studies. How do we restructure Islamic studies in order to fulfill these things and move from the hegemony of academic and business and politics-oriented thoughts and ideas and institutions into fundamental sciences, disciplinary sciences, strategic studies, and phenomena studies in intersecting circles, an area of dealing with the fundamental part of Islam, what we call usul, asluha thabit, the roots. And the disciplinary studies have to do with the status quo of academia and of knowledge and professions that we have today in order to reshape that. Phenomena studies is what we're trying to move those disciplinary studies towards, multidisciplinarity, transdisciplinarity, etc. And strategic studies is how to deal with all of this and how to deal with the world in a strategic way. Fundamental studies, fiqh wa tafsir al-hadith wal-kalam for the main branches. Disciplinary studies, how to move from the network of disciplines into multidisciplinarity. Phenomena studies, a similar network. And strategic studies, research, education, and action. And hopefully as an institute, if we are able to build something like that, or even start it, or popularize the idea of building networks of these 3 things, of action that is based on education, that is based on research. So this is the idea in a nutshell and some initial thoughts. I will stop here and get into the serious stuff, which is your critiques and your discussions. And Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Jazakallah khair.
Alaikum salam. Jazakumullah khair, Sayyidi. It's open discussion. I will not go to moderate the things and.
Yeah, I meant it to be like that because I believe that open discussion is deeper than programmed stuff. I can program this and give it to you in another 30 hours, and we're going to get to that after we finish the discussion. But I really want to get the high level kind of thoughts of people here first, inshallah. Faddal. Brother Yahya, perhaps we can start with you since you are the latest to join the group.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Alaikum assalam.
Jazakallah khair, barakallahu fik. Thanks a lot for the presentation. For now, I don't have many comments because I try to get it, I try to understand it. So it's very interesting. Alhamdulillah. Also, I try to, of course, to see how it can apply to my fields of research more specifically. But just have a practical question, which is not about the content. The slides you present, is it possible to obtain them? You can send it to us, yes?
Yeah, of course. Yeah. I'll send it to you by email. Yeah. I made them this morning, so I didn't send them, sorry, but I'll send them to you, inshallah.
Okay, inshallah. Jazakallah khair.
So what's the practical question? That?
Yes, this was a practical question. For the content, I'm just, as I'm new, I don't want to speak too much.
Well, you work on the ground, and I think that people who have a sense of what's on the ground of humanity are very important in such an intellectual discussion.
Exactly.
Because I happen to work on the ground as some stages of my life as an activist in student unions and whatever, and relief, and I have some history in that. And I think working on the ground is not void of ideas and deep ideas. But I personally used to work in my 20s and my teens, even work on the ground with a lot of wrong ideas, because the basic philosophical framework of the Islamic, let's say, activism when I was a kid back in Egypt, or eventually in America and Canada in the Muslim Student Association, without mentioning organizations anyway. I mean, the framework, the intellectual framework is not right. Now I say it's not right in my, hand. So I expect a lot of practical questions in the sense of how can this change the reality on the ground? Because it is the reality on the ground that the prophets came to change. They didn't come to teach philosophy, you see. And we try to philosophize because this is part of the complexity of what we're trying to build. We can't even move from point A to point B in today's civilization without a car or airplane, something really complex. So that's why we're trying to complexify, I don't know, things. But the reality on the ground is very important. So give me your first impression on how this could help reality on the ground. Does this have anything to do with the reality on the ground? Or maybe we should think about other things. What do you think?
I think it's very important to change the reality of the ground effectively. It's very important, but it may be done in various steps. It may take time, of course, but it's fundamental to begin with the deep ideas and from this strong. Oh, I listen my voice. Sorry. From this strong background, we could decline in more specific approach. But it's very important to have a clear vision, a clear background of Islamic knowledge, before of beginning to try to change the ground, because people won't trust us if we just begin with the concrete or practical approach. For instance, they will question our basis, they will question our legitimacy, and I think that's very important in that sense, to start with deep Islamic knowledge, a deep framework, As-Suffah, and then when it's done, of course, people in the ground won't understand all the details, but if they will ask where we take the arguments from, we have a reply and we can show the way. So that's, for me, that's very important. That's the main step. But, and as you said, I'm totally in line with what you said, that these ideas are very important to change the reality of the ground. Right now, just to talk of concrete examples, I'm back from Colombia. In Colombia, I didn't try to change whatever. My aim was to visit Muslim communities, Islamic organizations, and to see what they do. And I found out so many sectarian divisions, so many bad conducts in the name of Islam. So in the name of da'wah, many people do harm. They do wrong things, but they don't know. They think it's for the good. They think it's fi sabilillah, or they claim it at least. And to change that, it can be only done, I think, by the way of questioning the Islamic background of what they claim to be Islamic. So, and the approach you propose here is fundamental in that sense, because it's all about methodology. Because these organizations, mostly they play with a hadith or isolated verses, and they take what they want to bring their own political agenda. When I talk about political agenda, I think that the main problem in that part of the world is that people use Islam, or they claim to fight for Islam, but actually they want to fight for their own organization, either transnational movements or either local Islamic organizations, which seem to be a business at the end of the day. So I think to tackle that, it's important to be done in the field, but it can be done only after having proposed a deep, in-depth methodology like you propose. Because if I just come like this and talk, people don't care. They will say, who are you to speak about that. But if you show the relevance and the fact that the ideas are in line with the revelation, with Islam, it can influence people. It's very important because they are full of mistakes in the way they treat with the text. But it's a revelation, you know, it's a very in-depth approach. So I think that the challenge is to connect both. It's to connect the in-depth approach of methodology and to derive into practical ways and concrete practice which can change. But I'm totally in line with what you say in that example.
Jazakallah khair. Jazakallah khair. These are very important points. First point is legitimacy. If we are going to be speaking at that level and redefining or defining really, or teaching, if you wish, what Islam is about, the issue of legitimacy is a very important issue. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Quran is teaching us that prophets who carry revelations from Allah to the people are accused of not having legitimacy. But how did people measure legitimacy? قالوا يا نوح إنا لنراك فينا ضعيفا. You are weak, Nuh. You are weak. You are not one of the giants who lived at that time. You didn't have the technology. You are a weak guy. The best you can do is a big ship. But you really cannot do much. قالوا أن يكون له الملك علينا ولم يؤت سعة من المال. Talut, when the prophet told the people, Talut is going to be your king, they said, we're not going to listen to him. He doesn't have money. Right? So strength, money, وما نراك إلا اتبعك وما نراك اتبعك إلا الذين هم أراذلنا بادي الرأي. We have seen those who followed you are the lowest. So rank, society, you know, who are you? And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala told us about people who seek false legitimacy. He talked about the munafiqeen in like 20% of the book. He's talking about munafiqeen. It's a very important topic. There's not just the 11 who were in Medina, tried to kill the Prophet, and Hudayfa knew their names. It's not just that. It's not just that. Well, some of them became very prominent, but it's not just that. It's the munafiqeen is an attitude, is people who seek legitimacy. وَإِذَا رَأَيْتَهُمْ تُعْجِبْكَ أَجْسَامُهُم. You like their bodies, you know, they have, you know, very strong bodies. وَإِن يَقُولُوا تَسْمَعْ لِقَوْلِهِمْ كَأَنَّهُمْ خُشُبٌ مُسَنَّدَةٌ. But their talk is like wood. There is falsehood. It looks genuine, but it isn't. وَمِنَ النَّاسِ مَنْ يُعْجِبُهُ قَوْلُهُ فِي الْحَيَاةِ الدُّنْيَا وَيُشْهِدُ اللَّهَ عَلَى مَا فِي قَلْبِهِ وَهُوَ أَلَدُّ الْخِصَامِ. And they speak, and he's telling Muhammad with all of his insight that you will like what they say in the dunya. لا تعلمهم نحن نعلمهم. You don't know the hypocrites, but we know them. You see, Muhammad doesn't know them. So basically, the legitimacy here that they are trying to pose as legitimate. And how do they do that? With the superficiality, because as we mentioned, most humanity are totally willing to worship idols and to, you know, either prostrate to statues and cows and stars and عادي يعني. This is how humanity is. And therefore, instead of prostrate like bowing to a star, you can bow to me. And if I look like, you know, I'm wearing, you know, cheap thing, no, I'm going to wear a big amama and put a big pearl in my this and make a golden shrine where people are going to bow. And that is how it works with the nifaq. You know, لَيُخْرِجَنَّ الْأَعَزُّ مِنْهَا الْأَذَلُّ. The munafiqeen thought that they were glorified. And the Prophet ﷺ was humiliated because they had the gold of Medina and they had the, you know, this is the same story. So legitimacy here, we should make sure to define legitimacy. الشرعية or الحجية or proof, really حجة. What is a حجة? وتلك حجاتنا آتيناها إبراهيم على قومه. Ibrahim had the hujjah, had the proof, had the legitimacy in English would be based on what? Based on truth. And there will be always people who are willing to embrace truth for legitimacy, regardless of the fact that the person who is bringing the truth to them is a humble person and not a person who wants to rise. تلك الدار الآخرة نجعلها الذين لا يريدون علوا في الأرض ولا فسادا. Allah said in the hereafter, He will give it to people who don't want to rise in the world. They could rise morally and they could rise, by the relation with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But they don't want to rise in the ranks and the gold and silver and things that people bow for. And therefore, the legitimacy is a very important concern here. And we shouldn't be concerned how people view us if we have the truth. If we carry the truth, we just say it. And Allah will do with it, subhanahu wa ta'ala, whatever He wants. You see, some people will believe, some people will not. And that is our role. Our role is not to change the reality, our role to try to change the reality, to call. أدعو إلى الله على بصيرة أنا ومن اتبعني. I call for Allah with vision. على بصيرة, بصر بصيرة, with the vision, with an insight. Me and those who follow me. So that's point number one. The point number two is the sectarian divisions that you noticed in South America. It's everywhere. And that is part of what's happening. إن فرعون علا في الأرض وجعل أهلها شيعا. Pharaoh raised himself in the land because he divided people into fragments. شيع. إن الذين فرقوا دينهم وكانوا شيعا لست منهم في شيء. Those who divided the religion into fragments or Shia or sects, you are not, they don't belong to you. And in the other qira'ah that the Prophet also read, إن الذين فارقوا دينهم وكانوا شيعا. Those who left the religion. فرقوا is to divide and فارقوا is to leave. So he found the same word, and of course with Jibreel and so on and the qira'ah. So he read إن الذين فارقوا دينهم وكانوا شيعا. Those who left the deen and became sects. And why? Because they started to divide. He told his companions, لا ترجعوا بعدي كفارا يضرب بعضكم رقاب بعض. Don't return into kufr and killing each other. Sometimes when they fought, there is a truthful group and a group that the Prophet himself called al-fi'a al-baghiya, or the transgressors. So not always two wrong groups, but the division itself is a problem. The division in terms of a community is an issue, to the extent that Harun, when he went back to Musa sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, he told, إني خشيت أن تقول فرقت بين بني إسرائيل ولم ترقب قولي. فرق, the same word. Harun told Musa, you told me that do not divide them. So even when they went and worshipped the golden calf, he didn't want to divide them. That's how he had a fiqh of the time, even when they worshipped an idol. And then Musa told him, no, you shouldn't have done that. You should have just simply. So the sectarian divisions is a byproduct of scholarship that went astray, because people are divided based on the dunya, not based on the deen. When they were divided based on the deen during the time of the Sahaba, I mean, the benign, the benign divisions, if you wish, they didn't fight. They had differences of opinion from day one during the time of Abu Bakr and Umar, Uthman and Ali, but they didn't fight each other. They started to fight when people started to have nifaq, or hypocrisy. It's a long story, different story. But basically, there is a difference between difference in opinion and respecting the diversity that Islam has. Sufism and fiqh and hadith, fiqh in the legal sense, and hadith and tafsir. And it has people who are literal and people who are more into the spirit of the law, and people. This is normal, Islam, and some people are artistic and some people are not, and different tastes and different cultures and different climates. Islam is very wide. And sectarian divisions. So when you mentioned sectarian divisions, this methodology aims to bring people back to a common ground. And the common ground, unfortunately, is normally secularism these days. In the West where we live, when we deal with people, we say, okay, a common ground is secular. Even in the Muslim majority countries now, the common ground is الدولة المدنية والحركة المدنية, the civil common ground. And this is normally imagined by people as some sort of a secular approach. The common ground is not a secular approach. A common ground is to worship none but Allah and to work for the truth. إلى كلمات سواء بيننا وبينكم ألا نعبد إلا الله. This is the kalima sawa. This is the common ground. The word, the common word. And is not the secular ground. The secular ground is another religion that you are going to embrace. And yes, you can cohabitate with different religions, a multicultural society. I live in Canada, but this is not, this is not the Islamic worldview of a common ground. The common ground is one God subhanahu wa ta'ala and Islam, and people could deviate from that naturally. Well, that's too bad, but that's our common ground. So that's the other point. The third point that you mentioned, the last point, related to taking parts of the hadith or parts of the ayah. And that is part of the core of what we do here, is that the ahadith themselves are narrated mostly in a fragmented way based on the chapterization of the imams of hadith. Imam Bukhari, they said he didn't write a book of fiqh, but his fiqh is his chapters of hadith, because he said babun fika, chapter, and then the title of the chapter, that's the fiqh of Bukhari. And then he took fragments of the hadith that he knew to fit with the chapter. And that's fair enough. If I write today that book that you have, I have a hadith. I don't write the whole hadith, the 3 pages that I know about the hadith. I take the sentence that I need. So regardless of what happened, it's a complex story and requires a lot of PhDs really to discuss what the scholars of hadith did. But basically, I see it, the authentic ones, the good ones anyway, the ones whom I know from their collection that they meant well, at least. Yes, all of them have issues, and we all have issues as scholars. But those who meant well fragmented what they knew in order to fit their fiqh. And we need to restructure that in order to fit a new fiqh. So we take the same fragments or whatever, we combine the fragments, hopefully in bigger stories, and then make a fiqh for the family, a fiqh for medicine, a fiqh for physics, a fiqh for whatever it is that we want to do today, that are the outlines, the principles, the philosophical questions. And it is the political agenda, as you mentioned, that is behind the fragmentation of hadith from day one. Actually, what you are seeing on the ground today, history repeats itself. I'm part of, as you know, number of scholarly bodies. And sometimes I see a debate between two scholars and say, oh man, this is Abu Hanifa al-Awza'i again. Or this is, Ibn Abi Du'ad and Ahmad ibn Hanbal again, or whatever. And this is Az-Zuhri and what's his name? Hisham ibn Abd al-Malik again. And this is Muawiyah and Ali again. And this is, it's amazing. It's amazing, And history repeats itself. And that's why when we study hadith without the restrictions of the discipline, the restrictions of the discipline is one big political agenda. You study hadith with politics and with geography and history, and before that with the Quranic studies, of course. And you get into that, and then you understand hadith, you understand Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and you see how some people lied about him and how some people did not understand him, close to him, but didn't understand. It wasn't about this or that. It was about why? Because you are going to try to integrate the hadith and understand in a web of meaning. So So that's just for the sake of introduction. You're commenting on what you said, Akhi.
Yes.
Any other comment?
Yes.
Faddali. أهلا وسهلا. By the way, I have to acknowledge, and I did in the book, the effort that Dr. Basma put in the Arabic version in terms of ideas, but in the English version primarily, really, seriously. This was written in a very Anglo-Arab kind of language of mine, but Zallah khair that she made it in proper English. My guess of the level. Please go ahead. Jazakallah khair.
Shukran lillah. I have a comment. I'm always learning. There's always something new. And today I figure, so today what I kind of heard, the emphasis is new, is this idea or the emphasis on memorization in the beginning. But for me, hifz is like deen. Deen is not religion, and it has a much wider connotation. And hifz is not memorization.
Jameel.
It has a much wider connotation. So there is the element of preservation, there's the element of protection, there's the element of internalization and synthesis. And these do not necessarily involve memorization. And the reason why I wanted to question and probe this, because we're talking about methodology. And the Quran itself, or the revelation, started with Iqra, mish ihfaz. And it started with Iqra bismi rabbika alladhi khalaq. So it is some kind of reference to the created world. And then علم الإنسان بالقلم. So again, a reference to the written word. So my sense in reading and دورات التدبر is that reading is where the emphasis is, and a repeated reading and continually reading the Quran. And perhaps the idea of memorization and the emphasis upon it and the elevation that it gave to a certain class of scholars once upon a time was due to the fact that it was an oral tradition. And there were a lot of people who could not read and write. But yet the Quran emphasizes the importance of the pen and emphasizes the importance of the written word, hence all of the activities that we're doing. So I guess my question and my concern is this emphasis on memorization. And we know that many of the great Sahaba did not memorize, but they internalized the message in such a way that it was still hifz. So my question to you is, where do you get this emphasis on memorization in either the Quran or the Sunnah? And why do you feel that presenting it as such in the opening of a course like this or for the methodology is preferable to discussing the idea of reading and dawrat tadabbur that involve reading more than necessarily memorization?
Well, Jazakallah khair, a very, very legitimate question as usual. Barakallah feek. What you mean by iqra is what I meant by ihfaz, because حفظ يحفظ is not really is not a Quranic concept. حفظ, it's اقرأ, it's قراءة. It is جمع القرآن. جمع القرآن means to collect the Quran. The difference, I think, is between your description of the tradition as an oral tradition and my understanding of it as the oral tradition being the original form of knowledge. The Prophet ﷺ talked about the pen. He said, قَيِّدُ الْعِلْمَ بِالْكِتَابِ. Tie knowledge to books. بالكتاب. بالكتابة is ضعيف. Long stories, scholars debated some. And I realized that just سيدي خلاص قَيِّدُ الْعِلْمَ بِالْكِتاب. Anyway, just for those who are interested in the hadith. But it's an authentic hadith in the sense that he is saying, tie your knowledge. It's a matter of tying the knowledge. Al-qaid, al-hifz. It is not a matter of what we call in English memorization, or he memorized by heart and he really doesn't understand, or what we say in the Masri, احفظ وبعدين تفهم. Memorize and then you can understand later in life. No, it's not in the colloquial Egyptian sense or Arabic sense, and it is not in the English sense. Al-hifz in that sense is about what you mentioned exactly, about the protection. The memorization of the Quran is essentially about the protection of it. And therefore, when you memorize and anybody does any mistake, you correct, because you are protecting the letter, and the protection of the letter is the way of protecting the meaning, or one way, of course, and it is about synthesis in that sense, because when I know something by heart, I can start to connect it. Yes, I know that I have a paper in our civilization now, and even now it developed into a computer, and I'm connecting because I have a screen with the Quran and a screen with the Sunnah, and I'm just connecting. Yes, but it is a deeper knowledge to have those screens in your mind. It is not necessarily a condition for somebody to be a mujtahid. And I wrote that in the book, by the way. But it takes your relationship with the Quran in a different sense, because the sounds, if you know Arabic, and the sounds that you are going to recite and the rhythm is going to plant the meanings deeper in your heart. And I don't know how it sounds in English, but in Arabic, that is how it is. You know, when you read with a good voice and you chant with it, it goes deeper in your heart. And again, it's not a requirement for scholars or mujtahids in that sense. But if you are going to speak about the interpretation of the Quran, as I also mentioned in the book, and if you are going to come up with a new interpretation or a new exegesis, or you have to understand what you are talking about, and you really have to have it in your mind somewhere. Does that make sense? Please go ahead. The discussion is good.
Well, yeah, it makes sense. My issue is not, of course, we're not disagreeing on, I have to understand the Quran, and we're not disagreeing. I'm just saying that the positioning of memorization as a station that is above, to me, was part of the downfall of the faith, that we place so much emphasis on people memorizing, and they don't understand, because we didn't place the emphasis on the understanding, and we didn't place the emphasis on iqra. We did place it on ihfaz, and ihfaz by the meaning of readily recollect the words, not the meanings. And this is not the meaning of hifz in Arabic, but it's the meaning of memorization, and it's the meaning of hifz that came to be the norm in the Muslim world, which is recollect it readily, bring it up, but you don't really understand it. So the simple point that I was making when we're talking methodology or introducing the methodology, that these dawrat al-tadabbur, I think, to me, will achieve what you're saying, which is that the Quran is readily in your mind. The ayat are readily in your mind, even if you cannot readily recollect them like this, but you know the meanings. And to me, this is the depth that you were talking about earlier, the depth in the heart. So sudur, where the Quran might be, is very different than when it enters the qalb, is very different than when it enters the fu'ad, the inner heart, and is very different than when it's in the lub, and the deepest recess of the heart. And when we're talking about that kind of understanding of tawheed, the person, even though they might not have their head around all of the words of the Quran, they have internalized a fundamental meaning that unifies everything. Because you can't, even if you know the Quran word for word, it's not necessary that you understand how it is iqra bismi rabbika alladhi khalaq. You may not understand that fluidity of the text with the reality in which you live. And to me, that is fiqh. And so it's not the memorization, it's the readiness of the meanings in your mind and in your heart, and your capacity to see the fluidity of the text with the world. And you can't simply get that. To me, I think it's very beautiful when I know somebody has memorized, and I think it's very beautiful to have a nice voice for the Quran. I think it's one of our downfalls in this ummah that we said that is the highest station. I don't think that's the highest station. The highest station is someone who can tell me they know the words and they're reproducing it to deal with the conditions of life. To me, that is a faqih, and that is someone who understands.
Yeah, well, sure. I agree with you, since we are speaking English and we are in the context of Western civilization. And I think that is part of our role, is to fit what we are talking about in terms of Islam in the context of the civilization and the culture that we are living in. I understand the original culture, the current culture of Muslims memorizing the Quran, 10 years old, memorizing the Quran, and they don't understand a word of it. I agree with you 100%. But I'm not talking about those. I'm talking about the original culture, where you memorize the Quran as we memorize in the Western culture lines of Shakespeare or the names of celebrities, or we memorize a lot in English, but and it shapes the culture. I'm talking about a culture where the words of the Quran are at the core of it. They shape, يعني, they say, يا أخي لا تزر وزرة وزر أخرى. It's an ayah, but I'm telling no soul should carry the burden of another soul. And that's it. And then that is a cultural statement, because we memorized that. Or we say, Allah, alhamdulillah rabbil alameen. So, فقطع عذاب القوم الذين ظلموا والحمد لله رب العالمين. So it shapes the culture when people memorize, because that is how humanity works. And that is how in English we say things, because of hundreds of sentences that we memorize that shape our mind. I think hifz in that sense would shape the culture. It didn't, like in the current world where people memorize. When I was a kid and memorized the Quran, the Sheikh really, Allah yarhamu, yani great Sheikh, but never explained the meanings. Rarely. It's just احفظ وخلاص. يعني you memorize. Because there is a tradition of just having a copy in your heart. But it's really, it's wrong. I agree now. But I'm hoping that the culture would eventually realize the importance of the oral tradition. Because I think our culture today in the West is becoming too digitized. When I read about the volcano in Hawaii yesterday, and that it could grow bigger and so on, I thought, oh my God, I mean, if the volcano eventually shuts down the internet, that's what came to my mind yesterday. What are we going to do? You know, how are we going to read and write and teach? And because now our knowledge is moving from the oral tradition and even the paper and pen into these numbers on the screen. And if this shuts down as a civilization, we're back to the Stone Age. And I thought that the Islamic oral tradition is not just the Arabs of Arabia, but I think the Islamic way of orality has something to add here. Even though I see the cultures that are very oral and people who are just doing poetry, and so I've been to countries without mentioning names where people are they're just living in poetry, man. They eat poetry and they're sitting on the ground, and they are very poor. And that's not Islamic, of course. It's not just about talking. But I was just emphasizing. And by the way, the thing was just my personal experience, that perhaps I memorized without understanding. And perhaps the Shaykh, Allah yarhamu, had a wisdom at the end. Well, maybe you will grow and understand. And it helped. Allahu a'lam. But yeah, Jazakallah khair. Very
Jazakallah khairan. And perhaps my comment is because of my weakness.
No, Allahu Akbar.
I don't see myself ever, having that capacity. So
no,
subhanAllah, I'm just trying to save the other souls in the world that don't have that capacity either.
You're one of those English-speaking people that know the Quran very well, even though perhaps you cannot recite all the verses. You recite some of them that you memorize. And this is most of humanity. This is normal. There is nothing. And this is an advanced level of knowledge. When you know the book and you can refer, you know where to refer. You just have to look for the word qist and oh, here's the ayah. And that is fine for a scholar of Islam. That I'm repeating, it's not a condition for ijtihad, but it's a different culture, and your strength in the Western culture, I see it in your writings and in your ideas, because you come from a particular culture that has a tradition of writing and of philosophy and of arts and so on, and sees the world differently. And so far, see more successful than all other traditions anyway. So, Jazakallah khair, Jazakallah khair. No, inshallah. Ustad Hiba, Sheikh Mu'taz, comments or?
Yeah, I have a couple of questions, but I see that Yahya, he raised his hands, and since I am the hosting, I don't have the ability to raise my hand. So I will give the Yahya priority, then I will ask my questions.
You are the host, you can mute all of us and speak, no problem.
Bismillah. Yeah, I just agree with both of you, Sheikh Auda, Basma. I just wanted to add a comment because I think that most of your positions goes in the same direction, but with different aspects. My example comes from the West African context, naming like Mauritania, Mali, Senegal, even Algeria, even Morocco in the desert. So when we go there, even if we are adult, if we want to study in madrasa, we need to memorize the whole Quran first. And we are not supposed to ask any questions. Except in Mauritania have another way sometimes, but most of these countries, they emphasize of the memorization. And I think here we have an accident of history, because the system made sense in the past because the people who memorized the Quran were children. So they were like 5, 6, 7, when they are 10 years old or even before, they memorized the whole Quran. So for them, it was no point to ask questions where they were so young. But after, this was just a first step. And the second step was to faqaha, the fiqh, to comprehend, to study the meaning. The problem in history, since this century, we just have the first step. And when they finish the memorization of the Quran, everything is finished because they are too old or they are busy with other activities. But for tradition, they still continue that way. So I think that's a main problem, because it's just like if we keep the primary school and then we finish everything and the person is able to be an imam, although he doesn't have any understanding of the text. However, I think that in the memorization, there's still a very important thing, because when we memorize the text, as you precise, you get in your heart, and it's much easier to reflect on the meaning. I think that many people who are Hafid Quran, more they read, more they get meaning. And some people, but maybe it's more in the tradition of Tasawwuf, they claim to have some inspiration after years. So is the case of the Emir Abdul Qadir, for instance. He said that after 30 years of reading a verse, for instance, he finally understands. And he proposed a way of understanding ijtihad in the ta'wil of the ayat. But I think that both ways are, that's why I agree with both of you, because I still think that the memorization is so important. But normally it was supposed to be done at an early age. And now when you are 30 years old and you go to Mauritania or Mali or Senegal or Morocco to study Islam, the problem is that they still have the same approach. They force you to memorize all, and most people will be tired and they will leave without having understood any verse or any ayat.
I agree with you. I agree with you in terms of children, though it adds something, and perhaps Ustad Hiba could speak to that in terms of education. It adds what we call in Arabic al-hasila al-lughawiyya, or the vocab. When I used to memorize, before that, like in my early years, I speak, I don't know, Egyptian. I know the utensils, I know, what describes my school and the street and the parents, but I didn't know what describes many things until I started to memorize, and then I started to question, okay, what is this munafiqun? What is that? And what taqwa? And kitab, Injil. What is Injil? Oh, that's the book. So it is al-hasila al-lughawiyya. It is the vocab. When a child memorizes, it adds, as you know, the linguists say, about 17,000 to 20,000 words. If you memorize the Quran, it adds those 20,000 words in your mind. And this is a very strong hasila mahsul, harvest, a very strong harvest in your mind. Versus when I spoke Egyptian before that, they say Egyptians don't have more than 3,000 words in their colloquial. So versus the 20,000 words of the Quran. So the 3,000 words are very poor because you are describing things that are very basic. The rest of the 20,000s describe, al-haqa'iq, the truths that we don't think about in our day-to-day. So that's part of the education. Even as a kid, I went to an English school back in Cairo. I don't know, I'm speaking about myself. I apologize for that. But again, when they made us memorize paragraphs of Shakespeare, I think that's what shapes the core of my English. Perhaps that's why my English is better than my friends whom we came to Canada, we learned English together. But because as a kid, I memorized a little bit of Shakespeare and used to do this at school and so on, I have, some depth in the language because I used to, and I memorized parts of Les Miserables, by the way, as well. It used to be my favorite. When my French was much stronger, by the way, since Dr. Yahya is here. It was my favorite book, and I memorized parts of it. And I think it also left some French feelings and understandings in my background. Yeah, back to Dr. Mu'taz.
Actually, I would like to follow up this discussion, and I have many questions, but related to this discussion about memorize and iqra and collecting what is the meaning of jama'a fil Quran and etc. I'm concerned how we could use. I know that we are still in the introductions, but from the last time, I'm just wondering how could I use the Maqasid methodology as a tool to analyze these topics. How could the methodology will help me to analyze the importance of hifz, or in the beginning, how could I use it as a key or as a tool to analyze the meaning of the hifz, and then the importance of memorization, if it's important or not. How could I analyze? Because from my perspective, this question is related to the, or as a fruit or result from the medieval period mind, and related to the fact that the Quran is the first book in Arab culture. So when we talk about before the Quran, we don't have any kind of books. So the focusing on hifz is something related to have the ability then to revise it or to recite it, because you will not find a book in easy way to recite the Quran. However, don't want to go to this details, but my concern still is how could I use the Maqasid methodology as a tool or as a key to analyze all these topics. Because if I'm looking from Islamic classic usul fiqh or traditions, this is kind of series of questions or results and reasons. When I talk about recite Quran, then I talk about the translation of Quran. Could I have the ability to read the Quran in English in Salah or not? Because all of these results is kind of chain or series based on methodology that usul al-fiqh try to establish it. So this is the concern. And actually my question is, if we could have, I'm wondering if you could give us some definitions, very accurate definitions to the main expression that you used in the introduction. What did you mean by al-wahi? Is the Quran al-wahi or is the Sunnah al-wahi? I'm really interested in definition, because I thought we are in abstract ideas or intellectual level, theoretical level, before just going to apply these theoretical conceptual ideas on the ground, and how we could adaptate it or make this adaptation between the theoretical and what the real cases need from us to change or to have a modification. But we are still in the intellectual level. So in this level, how could I understand these outlines or these main expressions, wahi, fiqh? Did you mean by wahi just Quran or Quran and Sunnah? Did you mean by fiqh al-madhahib al-arba'a, or fiqh al-madhahib al-thamaniya, or al-fiqh al-mu'asir, or fiqh al-muqaran, or fiqh al-hadatha? What we mean by fiqh, what we mean by wahi, what we mean by these means means a definition. Why I'm looking to that? Because based on the definition, we could have the ability to restructuring the usul al-fiqh, or at least criticize usul al-fiqh. Because if, from my opinion, if we didn't go deeply to criticize usul al-fiqh, we will go to play in the same in the margins, or we will not do anything effectively, from my opinion, if we didn't have clear opinion from al-ijma', from as-sunnah, from what we mean by al-istihsan, what we mean by al-qiyas, all these concepts and tools. It will be just going in the details and forget the framework. This is my question.
The three questions. I always, your questions are always inspiring, Sheikh Mu'taz. Rabbina yakrimak. I'll get to the first question, and hopefully you see my screen here, my window to the English. Your first question is how we apply the maqasid methodology to understand these things. And here is the answer. Basically, the first step, how to apply the maqasid methodology to understand the issue of language and hifz and jam'a and all of that. The first step is the purpose, is al-qasd, al-maqsid. What is your purpose of your research? And in the book, there is elaboration on the difference between purpose and problem definition. Because if I define the world in terms of problems, I might misdefine the problem because I don't have a framework. But if I have a purpose, then I will go from the purpose to building the framework, and I will deal with the problems, of course, but basically my purpose is going to guide me. What is your purpose when you deal with the issues of language? If your purpose is education, you will deal with disciplinary studies, what we call in the last chapter, disciplinary studies. And therefore, you will go and make the cycles of reflection and the framework and the critical studies and the formative theories within the purpose of revising a discipline. My discipline is early child education, and I'm going to revise the discipline based on that. And therefore, I approach the language of the Quran and the issues of al-hifz, wal-jam'a, wal-kada, and the pedagogy based on that. If my purpose is to understand a certain phenomena, let's say my purpose is to understand the impact of the Swahili language or the Malay language. And therefore, I'm going to study the Malay language as a phenomena and versus Arabic. You see, in the Malay world, there are two movements. There is a movement that's trying to Latinize Malay, write it in Latin and put English and American words and so on, and Americanize Malay, and therefore eventually move from Malay to English, really. And you see this very clearly in some parts of the Malay world. Versus another movement that is trying to Arabize Malay. I'm going to bring back Malay to the Arabic. So if I'm going to study the Malay language as a phenomenon, and I am going to look at, my purpose is to understand that phenomena. I'm under phenomena studies. I'm doing the methodological steps in order to understand that. So I will go to the Quran and Sunnah and look at the phenomena in a different way. So my answer to the first question is it depends on the purpose of your question. If it is something related to a discipline or related to a phenomena or related to a fundamental basic understanding, which is you want to understand al-hifdh wal-jam' wal-qara'a wal-tilawa wal-tartil, fundamental studies. I'm just doing tafsir here. And I'm not applying to a discipline or to a phenomena. And al-jam' al-jama'at al-Quran. Jam' is a Quranic, is a prophetic word. To understand al-qara'a and al-jam' and al-tartil, then I build the elements and I do the study from the Quran to my understanding of the reality. So, because it's a fundamental study. So how can you use the maqasid as a tool is to define a purpose and therefore define a line of scholarship and a topic. And therefore from the topic you start to do the cycles of reflection and build a framework so that you can deal with the purpose. You achieve the purpose that you are. Now, there is a difference between historical studies and contemporary studies. If I want to understand the past and understand the oral tradition and so on, that is different as a purpose and as a domain. So that's my answer to the first, how do we use the maqasid methodology as a tool to understand. Your second question is a very interesting question. It is definitions. How do you define al-wahy? Definition in the project of the maqasid methodology is not based on ibaratun jami'atun mani'a, is not based on a statement that is exhaustive and inclusive. It is actually based on a web of meaning. I'll give you an example of al-wahy and of al-fiqh. Al-wahy is, of course, you can say al-wahy is something that Allah gives humanity, right? Through an angel. If you go to Ibn Taymiyyah, any of the other people, Ismiyun, or whoever, they will define al-wahy as malak that brings a message, an angel that brings a message to a prophet. And that's why Ibn Hazm involved Maryam sallallahu alayhi wasallam in the prophethood and this kind of. But if you read the Quran, al-wahy is different. وَأَوْحَيْنَا إِلَى أُمِّ مُوسَى. We have sent wahy to the mother of Musa. She was not a prophet. Maryam is controversial, but she is not a prophet. وَإِذْ أَوْحَيْتُ إِلَى الْحَوَارِيِّينَ أَنْ آمِنُوا بِي وَبِرَسُولِي قَالُوا آمَنَّا. Al-wahy to the disciples of Jesus. That is, what am I doing now is cycles of reflection. I define the purpose, which is to understand al-wahy. Second, cycles of reflection. So I'm doing cycles of reflection in the Quran and Sunnah, and I will explain the Quran and Sunnah. So the Quran, أوحيت إلى وإذا أوحيت إلى الحواريين. Okay, so وما كان لبشر أن يكلمه الله إلا ما كان أن يكلمه الله إلا وحيا أو من وراء حجاب. Allah doesn't speak except to humans except through wahy or behind a barrier. So wahy is not just an angel that comes to a prophet. Wahy is also that Allah gives an inspiration in English. Aisha radiallahu anha, in the hadith, أول ما نزل من الوحي, when she talks about al-wahy, the Prophet ﷺ, his experience with al-wahy, when the stone used to say Assalamu alaikum to him. that is, he started to receive the revelation. It's inspiration. It's طيب وأوحى ربك إلى النحل أن اتخذي من الجبال بيوتا. Here is وحي to non-humans. ثم استوى إلى السماء وهي دخان فقال لها وللأرض ائتيا طوعا أو كرها قالتا أتينا طائعين. So he subhanahu wa ta'ala told the heavens and earth, come, this is وحي. لو أنزلنا هذا القرآن على جبل لرأيته خاشعا. The jebel, the mountains, is like a fantastic topic. The mountains, if he had revealed the Quran to a mountain, he would have been shaking the mountain. إن عرض أمانة على السماوات والأرض والجبال. He offered the amana to al-jibal, the mountains. We want to carry the amana. The jibal said no. Al-wahi in the Quran has a number of meanings that has to do with the communication between Allah and humanity. The Prophet ﷺ is part of al-wahi in the sense that he, number one, recites the Quran. So that's number one of the sunnah is the Quran, really, of what he ﷺ is saying. And number two, that he ﷺ is yubayyin. وَنَزَّلْنَا إِلَيْكَ ذِكْرًا وَأَنزَلْنَا إِلَيْكَ ذِكْرًا لِتُبَيِّنَ لِلنَّاسِ. He is bayan. وَمَا أَتَاكُمْ الرَّسُولُ فَخُذُوهُ وَمَا نَهَاكُمْ عَنْهُ فَانْتَهُوا لَقَدْ كَانَ لَكُمْ فِي رَسُولِ اللَّهِ أُسْوَةٌ حَسَنَةٌ, and so on. So he ﷺ, according to the Quran, is part of that message, is part of the wahi. أتقرأ القرآن؟ قال نعم. قالت كان خلقه القرآن. His morals are the Quran. كان قرآنا يمشي على الأرض. He was the Quran. And therefore, I don't differentiate the Prophet ﷺ from al-wahi because his life is part of al-wahi. And when he ﷺ, but his life is a bit compound. There is some nuanced understanding that's required here. Number one, he ﷺ would recite the Quran. Number two, he would judge things, and sometimes he makes an error in judgment. The Quran is telling us it's not a moral error. He is ma'soom from the moral errors and the sins and the mistakes, but he makes a mistake in judging something that is not out of evil, but it's out of judging something with ما كان نبيا أن يكون له أسرى حتى يثخن في الأرض. It's not time for سلمية here. It's time for إثخان في الأرض. That is what he is telling him. Or عبس وتولى أن جاءه الأعمى وما يدريك لعله يزكى, and so forth. So he ﷺ, as a sunnah, we have to know his maqam, ﷺ, his status versus the Quran. What he says is subject to the correction of the Quran and is subject to the circumstances that he lived, ﷺ. Now, what he says is subject to have been said by him, aslan. يعني, he ﷺ, when he said, إنما الأعمال بالنيات, Bukhari number 1, إنما الأعمال بالنيات. طيب, did he say إنما الأعمال بالنيات? There is another narration, إنما العمل بالنية. Did he say this or this? Or maybe he said both, right? فما كان هجرته لامرأة أو امرأة ينكحها أو امرأة يتزوجها. These are all authentic narrations, and sometimes after the same person. So did the same person here ينكحها and يتزوجها? Did the same person here, أعقلها وتوكل, or قيدها وتوكل? Both are narrations. أعقلها or قيدها? Did he say both? Did he tell him أعقلها قيدها وتوكل? Of course not. He said أعقلها or قيدها. And therefore, what he said, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, is normally transferred to us by the meaning. And now it's not wahi, because it is wahi by the meaning and not necessarily by the language itself. And therefore, what is the meaning? إنما العمل بالنية. Deeds are according to intentions. That is the meaning. But I wouldn't treat what he says, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, as necessarily what he says, unless it's the narrations are telling me the same thing. Like, the narrations are telling us that he, sallallahu alayhi wasallam, said, تركت فيكم. I can't even remember a hadith that doesn't have different narrations. تركت فيكم ما إن تمسكتم به لن تضلوا بعدي أبدا. Kitab Allah, that's one narration. And the other, Kitab Allah wa Sunnati. And the other, Kitab Allah wa Aitrati. And, you know, and the Sunnah and Shia, they get into this. But this is obviously narrated by narrations, by people. And people, when they get into that, they narrate what they understand of him, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And that is why the very words are not necessarily wahy. أوتيت جوامع الكلم واختصر لي الكلام اختصارا في صلى الله عليه وسلم. And that hadith أوتيت جوامع الكلم is narrated by like a dozen narrations. Did he say أوتيت جوامع الكلم? Probably did, because all the narrations of the different companions have this segment. جوامع الكلم, جوامع الكلم. أوتيت جوامع الكلم. So probably he said that, صلى الله عليه وسلم. But he, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, I don't know exactly what he said. Now, on another level, what he said, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, sometimes is contradictory between narrators. الطيرة في المرأة والدابة والدار. Bad omens in the woman and your mount and your house. That's Abu Hurairah's narration. Aisha's narration. كان أهل الجاهلية يقولون الطيرة في المرأة والدابة والدار. Aisha's narration, also authentic. The people of the days of ignorance used to say the bad omens are in the mount and the house. So is it what the Prophet believed, or is it the days of ignorance? Now, here are two contradictory narrations. That's another level of complication in the Sunnah. That's why when you say Sunnah wal Wahy, that is Sunnah too, but which one is the Sunnah? Aisha went back to the Quran. said لا تزر وازرة وزر أخرى ما أصاب مصيبة في الأرض ولا في أنفسكم إلا في كتاب من قبل أن نبرأها. So she would support her version of the narration based on the Quran, going back to the Quran to reign over the Sunnah, not reign over the Rasul. The Rasul is ma'soom, but reign over what people say that the Rasul said. And that is another level of dealing with the Sunnah that is part of that methodology of the Darasat al-Sunnah, Ta'siliyah. So a Sunnah here is part of the Wahy in the correct sense of al-Wahy. Back to the definition question. The definition of al-Wahy is all the above, basically, is all what I said. I mean, for a student of knowledge, we could نختصر, يعني, we could summarize. We say al-Wahy is a message from Allah. And we leave it there, as we define in that book, المقاصد والمفاهيم والفئات والسنن والقيم. We define them in a sentence or two. But then I mentioned that the real definition is the full web of meanings that are around the definition. But that is not jami' mani. That's not inclusive and all exhaustive. Yes, it isn't. Because jami' mani is a philosophy, now is methodology. There is a difference between the logic, المنطق الاسمي يعني اللي هو الجامع مانع, kind of like, you know, أسماء, يعني the inclination of that definition in philosophy, and the المنطق, if you wish, الشبكي, or the web logic that we're talking about, the logic of connectivity, where the meaning emerges from the connections of the instances. And here, this is one of the major shifts back to the Islamic Quranic worldview. The Quran doesn't say البر ليس البر أن تولوا وجوهكم قبل المشرق والمغرب ولكن البر من آمن بالله واليوم الآخر والملائكة أولئك هم المتقون. He didn't say وذلك البر فقط وليس هناك من بر غير. يعني he didn't say that. He didn't say this is an exclusive, exhaustive. No, because he defined it. And then in a different place, he said إن الأبرار لفي نعيم لن تنالوا البر حتى تنفقوا مما تحبون. Here is another component of البر that he didn't give in آيات البر in البقرة too. But then he kind of added another dimension of البر. هدى للمتقين الذين يؤمنون بالغيب ويقيمون الصلاة ومما رزقناهم ينفقون ويؤمنون بما أنزل إليك وما أنزل من قبلك وبالآخرة هم يوقنون. For المتقين. But then in a different place, he said, and the taqwa has different dimensions. So the Quranic definitions of terms, in my perspective, according to the web understanding and the web logic, is not jami' mani, is actually open, and is open to additions based on the shabaka, on the web, and is open to the projection on the ground, the projection. ولا تبخسوا الناس أشياءهم ولا تعثوا في الأرض مفسدين. بخس الناس أشياءهم, or being unfair to people, or dealing inequitably, according to Shu'aib, is different from today. When you say لا تبخسوا الناس أشياءهم today, that is going to be different, because تبخسوا أشياءهم, Arabic is very general. Give people their things, their stuff. That stuff could be anything. You see, it could be money, it could be salaries, could be whatever it is, could be rights in a state that guarantees some rights. So the definition here is defined differently. And that is how a sunnah is defined at this level. Inshallah, we're going to get to hadith and sunnah. It's a long story. And I have something, inshallah, to say about that with your input. And in that sense, al-fiqh al-ma'asir, al-fiqh, how do you define fiqh? Is it the contemporary fiqh, the madhab fiqh, the Sunni, the Shia, the Ibadi, the Mu'tazili, the Zaydi? No, the fiqh to me is the Quranic fiqh. The fiqh is not any of these. And we and you, Akhi Sheikh Mu'taz, we come from a culture where fiqh is settled for hundreds of years, since the declination of the civilization. يعني من وقت يعني انهيار الحضارة الإسلامية، الفقه هو الفقه يعني خلاص يعني. Before that, if you read الجاحظ الحيوان, he's talking about fiqh. If you read Ibn al-Haytham, he's talking about fiqh. Ibn Sina is talking about fiqh. Al-Kindi is talking about fiqh. Ibn Khaldun is talking about fiqh. And these people are not dealing with the law. They are dealing with sociology and optics. And Al-Ghazali is talking about fiqh when he talked about the length of the earth, and that's fiqh according to him. So fiqh in the height of the Islamic civilization, I claim, was closer to the Quranic meaning that we would like to bring back. The English-speaking world and the non-Arabic speaking world doesn't have this baggage, by the way. It doesn't. We don't need to tell them that we are going beyond the four madahib. They don't know this. And it's not part of their culture. And yes, there's a lot of politics here in terms of making people join a madhab. But that's very weak because it doesn't have the roots that we have in the Arab world, where I used to live in Cairo. We go to the masjid. There are 4 mihrab, you know, where part of my memorization of the Quran and Sultan Hassan. There are 4 mihrabs. Why? Because Shafi'iyya don't pray behind the Malikiyya, the Hanafiyya, and the masajid for Sunnah and masajid for Shia. And we have a whole long history, and it's a very complicated history. In the West and in the rest of the world, and where we want to take the message next, doesn't belong to this. And the new generation, anyway, of Arabs don't care about this. Maliki إيه وشافعي إيه وبتاع. يعني, you see, so, but in terms of ilm, I agree with you, which is the third question, that we have to have a long discussion with usul al-fiqh. My sister Hiba knows, she works with me on the Arabic compilation of the Arabic version. We wrote about maybe 50 pages on الإجماع والقياس والاستحسان والاستصحاب والاستصلاح وسد الذرائع وعمل المدينة وشرع من قبلنا. I dealt with that in terms of the maqasid methodology in the Arabic version of the book. Inshallah, the Arabic, this will be added to the new Arabic version of the book. There is a lengthy discussion about all of this in relation to the maqasid methodology. But I don't think that the discussion of ijma' wa qiyas wa istihsan wa istishab wa istislah in the English language is important. I don't think it is. And I don't think that people should drown in that history when they think about Islam, especially that I think that the receivers of this message of ours in Maqasid Institute are mostly people who are professional. Yes, there will be some people of the students of Hadith and Quran and Tafsir and so on. But I think the majority of the students of this methodology, including myself, will be people who would like to apply it in real life, in professions, in organization, in strategy. And these people don't carry the same historical baggage that me and you carry because of the mawruth, you know, the the heritage that we have of the different madhahib and so on. We want to go beyond that. It's time to go beyond the Sunni and Shia and understand that the Sunni and Shia is the politics of some Islamic countries, but it's not an identity of the people. Some regimes would like to define themselves as حماة المذهب الشافعي وإحنا نحن المالكية ومش عارف إيش. This is the politics of the time. Nation states are trying to find some ideology in this. But I think in terms of how Islam should proceed, we should go beyond these labels, because Imam Shafi'i was the first one who was not really Shafi'i. He wasn't like that. He didn't do tahazzub. And when he prayed behind Abu Yusuf prayed behind him, he prayed according to the Hanafi madhab. He didn't have issues, And Imam Ja'far was not Shia, really. He was from Ahl al-Bayt. That's different. And so Imam Shafi'i said, إذا كان حب أهل البيت رفض فليشهد الثقلين أني رافضي. I'm Rafidi, I'm Shia. If loving them is going to make me call Shia. So these people in the beginning, Imam Ali was not Shia. What Shia? What are you talking about? Imam Ali is Imam Ali. And Imam Hussein was not Shia revolt, the revolt of Hussein. Of course not. He was a revolution of the time that was killed by the anti-revolution of the time. And the history repeats itself, you see. It's just how it works. And we should understand the bigger picture in that sense, that Muslims have to go beyond these labels if they are to be successful. Did I answer your questions, or you can follow up?
Yeah, and actually, I just want to keep the question about this examples, if the colleagues allow me.
Please go ahead.
Yeah, based on what you're talking about, and actually I'm very happy that in Arabic version that we have these topics, because I believe we should criticize the usul al-fiqh, because the majority of Islamic scholars don't think that who talk about the maqasid methodology understand the usul al-fiqh as they thought they understand it. So the first step is to present that we understand usul al-fiqh. We are very familiar with all these Islamic resources and hawashi and shuruh about usul al-fiqh, and we understand the terminology of usul al-fiqh and how each topic or each tool from the usul al-fiqh applied and how we applied it. But we believe that this is something need to be restructuring. The second, I would like to, from what I understand from your way to definition or to define the terminology or the terms, I could like to take two examples like Ahlul Bayt and Hadith Aisha. As Ahlul Bayt, if we go to the Quran, if we talk about this methodology, maqasid methodology, Ahlul Bayt or Ahlul Bayt as an expression, as a term in the Quran, talk about just the wife, Prophet wives, even Ibrahim wife or Prophet Muhammad wife. So based on that, we should say that Ahlul Bayt as a definition from maqasid methodology perspective is just Prophet Muhammad wives and Prophet Abraham wife, because this is rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu alaykum ahl al-bayt, which is which is Ibrahim wife, and also وَيُطَهِّرَكُمْ تَطْهِيرًا, also the I'm not feminist, but this is the actual what I understand from Ahlul Bayt. This is first term or definition. The second one is Hadith Abu Huraira and Aisha, and this contradiction between two hadiths. If I'm looking to Quran to try to understand what is the meaning of Sahaba radiyallahu anhum, I could find from the Quran that the people who make bay'ah before bay'atul Ridwan, who are the Sahaba. After that, Quran didn't talk about them as a Sahaba. So we have 1,500 Sahaba from Quranic perspective, or from Surah Al-Fath and other surah, like Ali Umran when talk about Ahl Badr, then Surah Fath talk about the people who make bay'ah under Ridwan tree. So based on that, Aisha is from Sahaba, Abu Huraira is not from Sahaba, so Abu Huraira is Tabi'i. So we give the priority for Hadith Aisha. This is, I'm trying to go far away or deeply, just to be sure that I understand the methodology or not.
Sidi, Al al-Bayt, yes. First of all, let me add to what I said a little bit, that the Dawarat al-Tadabbur are not only linguistic, are not only Dawarat Lughawiyya, Bahth Lughawi, but it's also Bahth Ma'nawi, linguistic search and search of the meaning. So Al al-Bayt, if we just linguistically, if we are only في ظاهر اللغة, إنما يريد الله ليذهب عنكم رجس أهل البيت ويطهركم تطهيرا. أهل البيت يعني أزواج النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم. If we go to Ibrahim, يعني Sarah and Hajar and so on. But if you go to the meaning, فإن اللهم صل على رسول الله فإن حاجوك فقل تعالى ندعو أبناءنا وأبناءكم ونساءنا ونساءكم وأنفسنا وأنفسكم ثم نبتهل فنجعل لعنة الله على الظالمين. فرواية ابن هشام عن محمد بن إسحاق, and this is going to get us right into the hadith, because Muhammad ibn Ishaq was made يعني weak because of his political views. Muhammad ibn Ishaq was not weak. Muhammad ibn Ishaq was imam of his time. And Ibn Hisham, and then eventually Ibn al-Qayyim narrated it in Allahumma salli ala when he sallallahu alaihi wasallam went out and he sallallahu alaihi wasallam presented Fatima and Ali and Al-Hasan al-Husayn in the mubahala. فنجعل لعنة الله على الظالمين. He brought his family, his al, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So in that sense, it's not just his wives. In fact, in that hadith, he brought his daughter, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and her husband and his grandchildren, and they went out. In the other hadith, Salmanu minna al al-bayt. So he is one of us. So al al-bayt is not just also by blood tie, but the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam would consider people to be close to al al-bayt and therefore part of al al-bayt. Al al-bayt in that sense is the Prophet's family. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. That's not just the wives, it's the family. قل لا أسألكم عليه أجرا إلا المودة في القربة. القربة, القرابة are al-al in that sense. So the qaraba of the Prophet ﷺ is part of the meaning. That's why the definition of al al-bayt is not just going to be a linguistic search in the Quran, but also in the Sunnah, and also a search of the meaning of al-al. Al-al, وَأَغْرَقْنَا آلَ وَقَالَ رَجُلٌ مُؤْمِنٌ مِّنْ آلِ فِرْعَوْنَ. He was not a wife of Fir'aun, and he was from the family of the bigger family. So al al-bayt in that sense are not necessarily only the 12 imams or the 6 imams or any of that, according to Zaydis, Shia, Ismailiyya, Shia, Al-Ja'fariyya. It's not just that, but it's al al-bayt in the sense of the Prophet's family. And he included, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, in his family, the husband of his children, and sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he included even a Persian guy that people were saying he is Ansari, he is Muhajiri. He said, Salmanu minna al al-bayt. He is from us. So al al-bayt is an open concept, and it has to do with the family and not necessarily the lineage of the 12. The hadith of Al-A'immatu min Quraysh that Muawiyah narrated, Bukhari narrated according to Muawiyah, and the Shia narrated differently that Al-A'imma Ithna Ashar kulluhum min Quraysh. Now, once you get into the difference between Muawiyah as a narrator and or people with him, as well as the Shia and contradictory narrations, then you stop. This will require a lot of research. It doesn't mean necessarily that Al-Bukhari included it that it's authentic, it's like that, or it's complete. It might have been part of what the Prophet said. الأئمة من قريش. The Shia are saying no, الأئمة 12 كلهم من قريش. And the other are saying ما زال الأمر في قريش ما بقي منهم اثنين. يعني هو now you get into really complex issues, and it's going to be very difficult to deal with this history now in the 21st century, يعني, or in the 15th century. In that sense, Ahl al-Bayt is a concept that includes the Prophet's family, sallallahu alayhi wasallam. And it is not necessarily one of the concepts that developed afterwards. When he said itrati in the hadith, and the hadith also is approved according to Sunni, if you wish, chains. Kitab Allahi wa itrati is also authentic. Itrati, itra, al-al, al-usra, you know, at the end, it's the same meaning. So that's the first, which is not really an answer. You can follow up if you want.
But isn't that, sir, guide us to reshape the terms of the Quran from hadith traditions? So we have in the Quran, Ahl al-Bayt is just Azwaj al-Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam, or the wives of the Prophet, regardless who is this Prophet. And now we reshaping the term in the Quran by the hadith. And that's what Usul Fiqh always used. They reshape the Sahaba meaning by, we reshape the Al-Qaraba. It's in, if we go to the Quran just as a Quran, we have ما أسألكم عليه إلا المودة في القربى وأنذر عشيرتك الأقربين. So we have the meaning of قريب أو قرابة. If we reshape this term by the Islamic traditions, we will fall in the same point that we criticize the Usul al-Fiqh that they.
No, there is a difference between the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ and the Islamic traditions. Mm-hmm. The Islamic traditions that came afterwards that defined the Sahaba in a particular way, defined al-waqf, defined al-khula', defined things that the Prophet ﷺ did not define. The Prophet didn't say waqf, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. We defined waqf in our history in a particular way. So the definition stays open because we defined it traditionally or heritagely. We didn't define it from the hadith. But if the hadith is proved that he says something, that explains the Quran. And that could be a legitimate addition to the Quran. So if he says, Salmanu minna al al-bayt, and the hadith is, there is no doubt about it. I mean, the hadith is everywhere. And therefore, the sunnah here is part of the Quran. وَمَا أَتَاكُمُ الرَّسُولُ فَخُذُوهُ وَمَا نَهَاكُمْ عَنْهُ فَانْتَهُوا. So Salman becomes part of Ahl al-Bayt, not because of an ayah that says Salmanu minna, because of a hadith. And an ayah that says, وَمَا أَتَاكُمُ الرَّسُولُ فَخُذُوهُ وَمَا نَهَاكُمْ عَنْهُ فَانْتَهُوا. So if the Prophet ﷺ is confirmed to have explained something in the Quran, he's not adding original additions. He's just explaining. Then that sunnah, لا تنكح المرأة على عمتها ولا خالتها. إنكم إن فعلتم ذلك قطعتم أرحامكم. So sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he said, a man cannot marry a woman and her aunt, because if you do that, you will break the ties of the family. That hadith is actually an addition to the tahrim and the tahleel. حرمت عليكم أمهاتكم وبناتكم وخالاتكم والمحصنات من النساء إلا ما قد سلف. So the ayah is explaining the tahrim in the marriage, and the Prophet is adding something. Is the hadith confirmed, or there are different meanings, different opinions? Like hadith al-rada'a, يحرم الرضاع خمس رضعات مشبعات يحرم. That hadith is disputed. You see, there are. So if the hadith is disputed, then it is not exactly an addition to the Quran, unless I believe as a scholar that it is authentic. Then if it is authentic, then the Prophet is merely explaining the Quran. In terms of your second question, the Sahaba is very interesting, because the hadith is, and this is a big topic, I didn't write in the book because I didn't want to open too many wars. In the hadith, the Prophet ﷺ is saying that not all the Sahaba are udul. فيقال فأقول أصحابي أصحابي فيقال إنك لا تدري ما أحدثوا بعدك. In the hereafter, people will be taken to the hellfire, and I will say, أصحابي أصحابي. And there is no other narration of this. And it is everywhere, the narration. My companions. He said, إنك لا تدري ما أحدثوا بعدك. You don't know what they did after you. من أصحابي 12 منافقا. When he said, some of my companions are munafiqun, right? And the ayah is even stronger. The ayah, of course, is stronger. That's why I started with Alhamdulillah والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله ورضي الله عن المهاجرين والأنصار ومن تبعهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين. I don't start وآله وصحبه أجمعين. I don't say this anymore. Why? Because I go to the Quran. I say لقد رضي الله عن المهاجرين والأنصار الذين والسابقون الأولون. the other ayah. والسابقون الأولون من المهاجرين والأنصار والذين اتبعوهم بإحسان رضي الله عنه ورضوا عنه وأعد لهم جنات تجري تحتها الأنهار خالدين فيها ذلك الفوز العظيم. وممن حولكم من الأعراب منافقون ومن أهل المدينة مرضوا على النفاق لا تعلمون نحن نعلم سنعذبهم مرتين ثم يردون عذاب عظيم وآخرون اعترفوا. The Quran is saying that there are categories, there are فئات. The فئة is called المهاجرين والأنصار والذين اتبعوهم بإحسان. Is Abu Huraira in that sense tabi'i? He is a tabi'i in that sense, in the sense of the ayah, but he is also a sahabi in the other sense, in the sahaba sense. Ashabi, I'm not saying that he is one of the people who will go to fire. I'm not saying that, but I'm saying that he is considered sahaba. The problem with Ahl al-Hadith is that they considered all the sahaba udul. Udul in the sense that once the sahabi says something, it's authentic, it's done. But the Sahaba didn't consider themselves udul, and the Prophet didn't, and the Quran didn't. I'm not saying he is munafiq, but I am saying that Aisha said that he made mistakes. الطيارات في المرأة والدابة والدار تقطع صلاة الرجل المرأة والحمار مش عارف إذا أصبح جنبا فليفطر. 70 حديث الزركشي من الإصابة فيما استدركته الإجابة فيما استدركته عائشة على الصحابة. And السيوطي الإصابة فيما استدركته عائشة على الصحابة. There are books written on this, how Aisha corrected the Sahaba. So when she corrected Abu Hurairah or Ibn Umar, or corrected Abu Bakr in one narration, or corrected, she is saying, أما إنه لم يكذب رحم الله أبا عبد الرحمن أما إنه لم يكذب بل هو بل أقول نسي أو أخطأ. نسي, he forgot. Why is the Sahaba immune from forgetting? That is a problem in the usul al-hadith, in the fundamentals of hadith. And it's not black and white. I'm not saying because Abu Hurairah radiallahu anhu made a mistake in that particular hadith, then all of his, because if you remove Abu Hurairah, you remove what, 60% of the narrations we have in Bukhari or everywhere. Abu Hurairah is not small in terms of hadith. And unfortunately, the Prophet's life ﷺ, was not recorded by all the companions at the same time. Ali radiallahu anhu is much more closer to the Prophet than Abu Hurairah. But Ali is آخر المكثرين. He's not, he is on the border of the people who narrated less. Aisha radiallahu anha was close. She narrated less than Abu Hurairah. He happened to have a very good memory. And we know that because most of his narrations are narrated by other people. He has some odd narrations. Abu Hurairah is complicated, man, because he himself made some mistakes and people who narrated after him made some mistakes. It is a fact that some of the tabi'een who narrated after Abu Hurairah had connected what Abu Hurairah said to Ka'b al-Ahbar versus Ka'b al-Ahbar. To the Prophet versus Ka'b al-Ahbar. When they say in Muslim أخذ رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم بيدي أبو هريرة فقال خلق الله التربة يوم السبت حديث التربة يوم السبت, and then he counted 7 days. Al-Bukhari commented on this. He said, how did Muslim narrate this? And Allah said in the Quran, he created in 6 days. الوقت انت Muslim is narrating after Abu Hurairah that the Prophet took his hand, and then a very biblical narration al-Isra'iliyat. That's why in the hadith, we'll talk about it. There is al-mar'a, wal-siyasa, wal-Isra'iliyat. These are the three problems in the hadith. The women, politics, and the Isra'iliyat, the children of Israel narration. He أخذ بيدي, he took my hand, and then he counted those 7 days. The only thing that's left is that he rested in the Sabbath, but he didn't say that. And that's the same thing in the Bible. Abu Huraira is complicated because he himself narrated different things. Some the other companions corrected, and some he was right, and some he said that he will not narrate, otherwise he would be killed. That's what he said. يعني حديث الجرابين إن عندي جرابا لو فتحته لقطع مني هذا الحكم. يعني he was saying that if I narrate everything I know, they will kill me, right? And yes, there were narrations that were very interesting that were narrated by other people. Muhammad ibn Ishaq and Abu Bakr al-Hudhali, and that's why they were considered weak. The narrations, about the children of Marwan ibn al-Hakam, and so, these kinds of narrations. And it becomes very problematic because a century after that, the scholars of hadith decided that it's best not to intervene in what the companions differed over. نعرض عن الخلاف فيما شجر بين الصحابة. طيب. But whoever narrated something that stands with Imam Ali or حديث الفئة الباغية, ويح عمار تقتله الفئة الباغية, Ammar is going to be killed by the transgressors, which was the Muawiyah's army. The hadith الفئة الباغية hadith متواتر, يعني it's everywhere. You really cannot change that. But there are other hadith that are different. It becomes complicated because now the ta'rif al-Sahaba is at the heart of the problem. Al-Muhajirun wal-Ansar is what the Quran is saying. And I think we should go back to the original. وَمَنْ تَبِعَهُمْ بِإِحْسَانٍ وَالَّذِينَ اتَّبَعُوهُ بِإِحْسَانٍ رَضِيَ اللَّهُ عَنْهُمْ. So if you consider Abu Huraira to be tabi' bi-ihsan, then رضي الله عنه. That's what we say. That's why we say رضي الله عنه. So I hope this answers the question for now. Yeah, and it opens it. Other hands are raised.
I don't want to take anybody's time, but I really think and I hope that, especially in these sessions, we make an effort to link the discussion to our purpose today.
Yes, yes.
So that we're not spending too much time on issues that may have been relevant 1,000 years ago. And I don't even know personally how they were relevant even 1,000 years ago, but whatever. Today, to be honest, they're not relevant. It's not relevant who got on first and who got off and who wore what and who did what. I'm very sorry. I mean, I just really, for us to stay focused on purpose, our purpose for the methodology today and beyond traditional fiqh and beyond ulum al-hadith. If we can just do that, I'd really appreciate it.
Jameel, Jameel. I appreciate that. And I will always appreciate you, Doctora, bringing us back to track for the bigger purpose. Let me add, though, that these things are important because they are part of the fundamental studies. They are part of the usul studies. As we mentioned, that every knowledge has its history.
100%. And I agree with that, but we're not all fuqaha. I mean, the point, I want to take it in policy. Somebody else wants to take it in psychology. Somebody else wants to take it in education. But if we could just keep these sessions so we can all benefit equally from what we're receiving, I would just really appreciate it.
I totally agree with that. This would be my handicap because if you're going to speak about policy, I will not be able to speak with you as fluently as I do with hadith.
I promise I won't.
No, but
not in these sessions.
You can do it. I mean, when we get to disciplinary studies, for example, you can get to that. When we get to hadith studies, this session, I'm trying to open the issues. I'm trying to show the magnitude of the restructuring that we are trying to make. But Jazakallah khair, very good point. Do you want me to go back to the presentation and do some highlighting of what I wanted to highlight, or do you have questions?
Can I have a comment here?
Please go ahead. Go ahead.
Well, actually, adding to Dr. Basma's comment, it would be great if we also have some sort of an overview of what each of the following sessions will entail in terms of what topics we'll be focusing on, so that we can become well prepared beforehand. A question which may be, given that the focus is on the application of the methodology, in what ways do you think that the application of this new methodology could go wrong, could not achieve what it is meant to be achieving? Because at the end of the day, the application is always dependent on the people who will apply it. And the way they apply it could be skewed and could lead to certain ends which are not in line with the objective that was meant to deliver.
Two very good points, Dr. Tamer. First of all, the plan, inshallah, I plan to take from the chapters you have, 2 chapters in the beginning, like in the next session. I will send you the plan, inshallah, through Dr. Mu'taz. 2 chapters and then 1, and then 1. 2 and then 2 and then 1. I will send you, inshallah, the plan in terms of chapters, so that you have exactly the chapters that we will focus on. That's question number 1. Today, I wanted to give an overview and see what's on your minds, and try to open issues to really as an introduction to the different outcomes of that. Your question is very, very, very important. What could go wrong? How do you define right and wrong is based on the achievement of the objectives. And therefore, what could go wrong is anything that defies the objectives of the Quran. As long as what you are trying to do is in the line of trying to achieve the objectives, then you are successful. You are trying to do something on the ground. If something that is ijtihad is going to take us to wrong areas, like for example, one of the objectives of the Quran is to obey Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in his amr and nahi, the commands. So if something is going to make riba halal or zina halal, Allah forbid, or any of that, then it's wrong. Yani, what could go wrong is people eventually reaching ends that are not the ends intended in the project. I don't think what could go wrong is to bring a new opinion, because we should bring new opinions and new ways of looking at things. It is more difficult in the fundamental sciences, but it is very welcomed and very important in the applied sciences and the phenomena studies and the strategic studies. We are very primitive in this area in terms of Islamic thought. And I don't think things could go wrong that easily in that. As long as people have the right purpose and they try, they add things. There is no one single answer for questions of policy or questions of health or these kinds of questions that are very complex in current disciplines and current phenomena. And therefore, I don't label somebody as wrong if they bring a different way of healing a sickness, or a different way of understanding a policy, or a different way of building a city. This is all fine, because we are in a matter of ijtihad. And in this case, إذا اجتهد الحاكم فأصاب فله أجر وإذا أخطأ فله أجران. If you make a mistake, then you have 1 reward. And if you are right, you have 2 rewards. But I'm not going to get into the politics of Abdullah ibn Amr and narrating that hadith. But basically, this is hadith with the right meaning, inshallah, in the ijtihad sense. And it's one of the hadith that we rely on in using the word ijtihad in that sense. I want to see both questions that we have as well. Please. Dr. Ildus, please, and Dr. Marwa.
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam.
Okay. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Thank you for the great discussion. And one interesting thing I have regarding methodology is that I don't have that legacy or the background that many from Muslim majority countries they would have. And I also have the experience of living here in Malaysia and studying at the Islamic University, undergraduate and postgraduate, and I did my PhD here as well. And I have the experience of observing people from the Muslim countries and people who were brought up with the hifz and with the hufaz and others. And when I personally, if I don't have that baggage, it's easier for me to see some of the problems with the methodology, with the philosophy. And it became much clearer when I started thinking about Islamic economics and Islamic finance and halal industry as an industry. So from there, I saw that if you go back really to philosophical questions that the Quran is raising, to ethical questions, and then you could form a better perception. And this is one of the things that you have mentioned earlier in one of the talks that I remember. When you form a theory, it's basically a composite perception. The theoreticians or the scholars' perception. And when you have that baggage of too much, maybe that you have too much in your mind, and it has certain philosophy in your mind when you cannot get rid of, and it really bears on the your way of thinking and the methods you are using in research and the methodology in general. So what I see, how do you address this issue of perception through this methodology? Because it's in my experience, I see here a lot of Muslims in Malaysia, they are really afraid of analyzing the Quran. They read it, but they don't. They're afraid of even questioning it. I mean, and it's a problem. So how do you intend, or how do we address this issue? Thank you.
جزاك الله خير دكتور الدوس. جزاك الله خير. أخي, you might lack the historical legacy and the historical background, but you don't lack any capacity in terms of carrying the research that you would like to carry out. You would like to study economic issues related to halal and so forth. You could start on a blank page, and you don't have to memorize all the history that we have about this, and you will be as qualified as everybody else. Of course, I would recommend that you study the history of what you are talking about, if it has a history in our Islamic civilization, because when you come from a certain history, you are able to critique some ideas on the ground better. How to deal with the legacy or the background deficiency is actually the methodology. The methodology is not assuming that you have an expertise in the history of Islam, as in post-Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. The history of Islam is from the time of Adam anyway. But it doesn't assume that you have that expertise. And you don't have to, if you are going to have an applied phenomena study or disciplinary study, you don't have to get into these issues. People are afraid, not just in Malaysia, people are afraid everywhere of touching the Quran because they don't understand it, and because it is taught to them wrongly as some sort of a untouchable text. How do I know what I'm saying? I know it from the Quran itself. The Quran is asking people, Muslims and non-Muslims, to read it. And then we have these silly issues and silly opinions that don't allow a non-Muslim to touch the Quran. How can they read it if they cannot touch it? You know, and the Quran is asking them to read it. You know, and the Quran is asking us to follow it. How can we follow it if we don't read it, if we don't understand it? Oh, you ask a sheikh and the sheikh will tell you how to follow it. Now that's politics. That's why I got into the Sahaba issue. It's a long history. And I apologize if the background and the names are not familiar to some of you. But basically, this is a very important history in the fundamental studies, not necessarily in the phenomena studies or the disciplinary studies, perhaps under the discipline of hadith, but not really, it's not relevant to everybody. But what I'm saying is that there is a long history of priesthood, if you wish, in Islam. Rahbaniyah, you know, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said that Rahbaniyah is Rahbaniyah tad'awah, and we made Rahbaniyah, we made priesthood, we have a Rahib, Rijal al-Din, we say in Arabic. Until today, we say Rijal al-Din. There's no concept in Islam that's called Rijal al-Din. Or first of all, it's not only Rijal, it's Rijal al-Nisa, men and women, but there is men of God, and we don't have that concept. So my answer to your question, Akhi, is that no, there is no problem in lacking that legacy and that historical background. And in fact, as I mentioned to Akhi, Dr. Mu'taz, when he talked about usul al-fiqh, that the non-Arabic and let's say, Islamic majority kind of world doesn't have that background and doesn't care about that. And I don't think is relevant to what they need to do in terms of disciplinary studies and phenomena studies, which is what we are trying to do. I would urge, though, that you go back to the Quran in the definition of halal. A final comment on what you said, Doctor, that halal business and halal studies, been to Malaysia many times and lived there for a little while. And I know that sometimes the halal definition in the Malay world is very superficial, sometimes.
Yes, yes.
And the Islamic banking sometimes is superficial. Even the imams of the Islamic banking said that. I mean, Sheikh Qaradawi wrote that in one of his books, even though he was one of the major people who promoted Islamic banking back in the 70s and 80s. He said that a lot of the Islamic banking is shakliyat, is superficial. And so even the fuqaha of the time who are really into this, they admit that there's a lot of superficiality. So when we do Islamic banking, inshallah, Dr. Basma is going to start, she's writing a proposal these days, is going to start a group under the Maqasid study, a research group on halal, on Islamic finances and the policy, right? And if you are interested in that, Dr. Ildous, please talk to Dr. Basma or Dr. Zaid, and you can join.
Well, my PhD thesis was in the title was Methodology of Islamic Finance.
Oh, Allah Akbar.
And I looked at it. Yeah, I looked at it from the point of view of dhann as conjecture, because we do have a lot of conjecture in that area.
Big time.
And also uncertainty, and from uncertainty point of view.
Nice. Well, welcome to the research group then on Islamic finance and public policy. We are talking to a couple institutions actually to host us in terms of a center. Like we have dreams about that project, inshallah, where it goes. And inshallah, you will receive then something from Dr. Basma, Dr. Zaid about that, inshallah.
That would be good. Thank you.
Jazakallah khair. I also see another hand. I want to cover the questions in the time, please.
Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum assalam. Alaikum assalam.
Assalamu alaikum jami'an. So I don't have actually questions. I have comments concerning the methodology of research. I just want to recall that I'm from a political science background, and I used to do my researches in a certain methodological way, which we depend on like primary resources and secondary resources. And even if you have like a field research and so on, it's some typical kind of research, you know, your way, and it's not really very complicated. And then when I started contacting you, Dr. Jasser, before that, when I actually started my PhD, I was thinking that, okay, I know it's something big for me because my Islamic background is from my readings and from my tarbiyah and how I was actually grown up reading and memorizing Quran and reading in actually literatures concerning Islamic studies and so on. It's free readings. I have no Islamic study, any regular basis Islamic studies. So I was actually very afraid that I would do something wrong because I don't know the way. So if you haven't started this studying Islamic studies, you actually are some cautious, some way cautious about your way. You don't know where to go, from where you start. It's not like the political science way of research. And then I was thinking, okay, so I will, what is in my mind is that I would be cautious. So I will go cautious in only having from the secondary resources, which are the fiqh books and so on. So that's for me a safe line. And then when I started talking to Dr. Jasser, the first thing he told me that I have to go for the primary resources or the original resources here in Quran and Sunnah. They are originally more than primary resources. And then I didn't understand him. So what are you asking me to do is to go to the original resources, to Quran and Sunnah, and dig deep in them and research and do what is called like Dawrat al-Tadabbur. And I think this is very big for me. I'm not مؤهل to do something like that. And then now today I didn't understand it right at the time that Dr. Jasser told me about, but today from your the presentation, I really got it. I really got what do you mean from going to the original resources, because I didn't have in my mind this plan, this academic plan of what kind of resources I have to depend on firstly and secondly and thirdly and so on. So, and then I was actually excluding all about Quran and Sunnah as original resources. Again, I thought that this is a very big step for me. Maybe later, when I became more professional and specialized in Islamic studies, I would be able to be like a mujtahid, which is digging deep in Quran and Sunnah. But now it's a big step for me. But now, today, I understood that it's a very important step. And if we are not going to have each one who's trying to research, to make research and to search in these topics, which is combining especially the al-ulum al-dunyawiyya with the Islamic studies, and not digging deep in the Quran and Sunnah and going safely to the fiqh as a secondary resources, we are not going to make change. So that's the first rule I wrote today concerning the methodology of research. The second rule concerning memorization of Quran, again, it was something deep in my mind, but I wasn't applying it. I didn't have the full scene of it until today when you mentioned it. Because for me, memorizing Quran is a part of, it's something of ibadah for me. But with time and with the practical exercise of it, I now feel that it makes something of networking and connecting the meanings of words, the meanings of the stories, the things which are repeated and how they are connected together. So it's kind of, it could be a long-term way rather than the Dawarat al-Tadabbur, but it's a kind of way in which you use to really have a deeper understanding of Quran. It stabilizes the meanings in your heart and the connections between things in your heart, and it stabilizes also how you understood Quran in your mind. The third thing which I would like also to emphasize from your from today is that, and actually that's one of the things I always apply and adopt, is combining both the academic research, the academic line we walk through, with the practical application of this in a cycle which is always giving each other's and enriching each other is a very important thing. We're not going to go a further step without having this cycle closed: the academic research, the practical applications, reflection, and then going back to the academic research and so on. The last thing is concerning the opening the doors of applying circles of reflection on personal singular level as well as on group level. So يعني doing it يعني every researcher do it, scholar do it يعني alone, and then have a group of people who is actually reflecting with them on his يعني دورات التدبر. And that's it. Thank you. Thank you a lot for today.
الله يحفظك. جزاكم الله خير. يعني to comment quickly, I think first point, we need to break the barriers of fear when it comes to dealing with the Quran. And that is part of what we should do in the Maqasid Institute with this methodology. And that is part of Dawarat al-Tadabbur that we will all do, inshallah, next time. And when we start to apply in your own fields, we should not be afraid of making ijtihad based on an understanding. But of course, there are details. At some point in the book, we mentioned the Arabic competency in the Arabic language versus disciplines and phenomena versus, like we will discuss the issues, inshallah, related to that. But generally speaking, we should break the psychology of fear when it comes to reading the Quran. And, the hadith when Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu said that, what sky would allow me and what earth would allow me to do if I say something wrong about the Quran. Yes, it's true, but doesn't mean that you don't reflect. And what Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu meant is to manipulate the Quran. But if you are a political scientist, as Sister Marwa, or if you are a policy person, or if you are an economist and you read the Quran, you are going to see the political theory in the Quran better than I do, as somebody who studied jurisprudence and law and stuff. You see, that's different because you have an eye. Dr. Yahya works with social movements and social organizations. He will see poverty and whatever different in the Quran because he comes from that eye that deals with relief. So he will see different. A sheikh who never did relief and never dealt with poverty and never dealt with problems cannot really see, even if he memorizes the whole thing. So it's important to break the barriers because these people are the only people who can make that ijtihad. The second point, about what you mentioned, Dr. Ulum al-Dunyawiyya, it's not really like that. In the book, inshallah, there is a critique of dividing the ulum into dini and dunyawi. And that is part of the project that we will discuss, inshallah, in restructuring the ulum, restructuring the scholarship in that sense. We don't have ulum Islamiyya and ulum ghair Islamiyya, Islamic university versus non-Islamic university. We don't have that. We have disciplines because this is the status quo of academia. We're going to deal with them. And we have phenomena studies and we have fundamental studies and so forth within that sense, but we don't differentiate dini and dunyawi. Finally, the Dawarat al-Tadabbur and alone and network, that is also part of the manhajiyya, how to build networks of ijtihad. Collective ijtihad in that sense is going to be networked through a web. And that is towards the end of the book, just as a suggestion for the way forward. I don't know if you have this version of the book, the way forward. The way forward is to build those networks and for the networks to start to effect a change on the ground. So this will be part of the manhajiyya too. It's not, inshallah, outside it. I see Sister Ajarat as well, mashallah, if she's hearing us.
She went to pray Maghrib.
So Ajarat is praying Maghrib? Okay.
Maghrib, yeah.
Oh, mashallah, no problem. Any other comment? Please, what I did today as well, I will receive any comment, inshallah. What I did today is a very wide, some of it is just, personal reflections, and some of it is a wide scope kind of survey of the topic. Inshallah, the plan will be sent through Dr. Mu'taz, 2 chapters by 2 chapters roughly, where we discuss the ideas and focus on particular issues and how they apply, yes, but through the topics themselves, inshallah. So that's my, please, Ustadha Hiba.
Assalamu alaikum. I think we don't have the time, but I have a comment here. We have a big challenge, I think, or a question about how we will control exploring words network, as you say, Dr. Jasser, for each meaning, if it is not depend on linguistic analysis only. You know this, always the comments about مقاصد methodology, يعني it's not ليست دقيقة عند الكثيرين.
ليست منضبطة.
Only sense. So I don't know how we can get this.
Oh, that's a question. Well, that's a short but very big question.
No, it's not a question. It's a challenge. I think.
والله أقول لك يعني هو there is a difference between different domains of research and different domains of thought. يعني I'm not going to stand in a khutbah and I give khutbah zir. I'm not going to stand in a khutbah and tell them that the definition of Ahl al-Bayt is a web and it really evolves with time. This is for thought and for scholarship. And yes, I'm going to say that too. But if I'm going to explain to the public, I have to simplify. And part of the simplification is to give definitions, is to define, is to say that, well, al-maqasid kada. And it is very close to the mind to define linguistically, at least the Arab mind or the Muslim mind in general, that zakah is from tazkiyah and salah from sila and all of this and that. But I think that scholarly speaking, we should go beyond the linguistic definitions, and hopefully the culture will change by time. So we are working on different levels here. One level that has to do with the public talk, where we have to speak to people in the language they understand. And another different level is the scholarly level, where we are working in parallel to change the perception of definitions from the narrowness of linguistic, بحث بالجذر and so on. It's not just the root. It's narrow. It's correct, but it's narrow. And we have to, expand the definition because that's how we can contemporize it, how it can be in العصرنة يعني. That's how it can happen. If we expand the definition of justice. And please, Doctora, please.
No, I'm just going to add to that. It's not just essence. Yeah. So even the Quran itself, in its very methodologies, utilizes different ways of expressing meaning, not just through words. So when we have, for instance, a metaphor, this is to look for meaning. When we have a story, القصص, it's actually giving you a whole set of verses that express a meaning that cannot be found in just the words. So the Quran itself does not express its meanings exclusively in words, but has different techniques to express higher levels of meaning and values and things that cannot be expressed through singular literal techniques or even through language. We assume that language is written, going back to our initial discussion in this presentation. Meaning is not necessarily written. And of course, the Quran and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala fully understand this, that you can acquire meaning, not through language, but through your heart and through the different techniques that the Quran uses to get you to use all of your faculties to understand those meanings. But the Quran nafsu is not necessarily primarily linguistic. And I would argue that it's not.
Yeah. Yeah, the word عفة, for example, is mentioned once. وَلَيَسْتَعْفِفِ الَّذِينَ لَا يَجِدُونَ نِكَاحًا. But Surah Yusuf, for example, is all about عفة. But he didn't say the word عفة, but he gave us a long story of a young boy who really struggled with that throughout his life. So this kind of thing. So the meaning is not only defined in language. عفة يعف والأصل كذا أصل الكلمة العفة. It's not just that, but it's part of the legacy as well of the decline of the Islamic civilization, because the Sahaba and the generations early, they didn't define things that much. You see, they didn't start التعريف في لغة واصطلاحا. This is محدث يعني. This is much later when they started to define linguistically and then terminology. Imam al-Shafi'i wrote a risala, didn't do that. He didn't say الإجماع لغة أجمع يجمع فهي جماعة واصطلاحا هم. He didn't say that. He just talked about إجماع from his perspective in a particular sense.
But so, the challenge is, how could the maqasid methodology put the borders? Because all the interpretation theories is trying to expand the literal meaning or convert or move from the literally to the wide side of meaning. But to which border? All the techniques that be used as a metaphors, then as a sampling theories, even in Sufism sampling or Shia symbolism or Batiniya symbolism, or after that, even maqasid in the tradition or classic meaning of maqasid is kind of expanding the literal meaning to the metaphoric meaning or the wide range of meaning. But how we could use the methodology here to make the borders between the expanding of the meaning or between this networking and the liquidity, because based on the modernity, I'm afraid that we fall in the liquidity. What is the borders? What is the absolute that we have?
صحيح. Well, Jazakallah khair. This is a very important question, and I will give very quick answers. Inshallah, we'll discuss more. One border is الثوابت, is the issue of constants or fixed. And there is a discussion on that in the book. What exactly are the fixed constants that we are not really addressing and we are not tampering with? We are not tampering with the definition of sin, for example. يعني الذنب والخطأ والكبائر والصغائر. We are not. This is we are not tampering with the ibadat or the rituals or Quranically الشعائر. We're not really going into شعائر الصلاة والصيام والحج. And so الثوابت, we are going to talk about that. And al-markaziyat, or the central meanings. The central meanings are borders. We are not going to change the meaning of ibadah or taqwa or qist or sidq, or these are central, or zawaj or riba, or like is the central meanings, the meanings around which so many connections are made in the web are fixed. And they are really part of the borders, يعني الضوابط or المحددات or limitations, so that people don't project al-hadatha and modernity. In fact, this is one of the problems we discuss next time, inshallah, because it's in chapter 2 on al-tabrir or apologism. They bring a concept from modernity and they project it on the Quran and make the Quran as if the Quran is talking about democracy or not saying democracy it's not black and white, but it's not the tabrir. Inshallah, when we talk next time about the limitations of the current schools of Islamic thought, we will discuss the dawabit of the maqasid methodology that is trying to put borders, inshallah, on the thinking. So we don't fall in apologism, we don't fall into alteration, inshallah. Allah jazakumullah khair. I think it's time to make dua. 3 hours is a long session for you. I'm really appreciative of your time. Allah bless you. This is fantastic, fantastic discussion. And I see everything in the discussion is in the right place in that web of meanings that we created with this maqasid methodology. And inshallah, for you who were able to attend, inshallah, for those who are not able to attend, inshallah, ya Rabb, they are doing very well, and it's just something temporary. And inshallah, they can catch up and watch the video. For those, all of you who will watch this as partners in this project, jazakumullah khairan. And inshallah, we continue to learn from each other and continue to work for something good in this world, inshallah. اللهم اغفر لنا ذنوبنا وإسرافنا في أمرنا وثبت أقدامنا وانصرنا على القوم الكافرين. ربنا لا تؤاخذنا إن نسينا وأخطأنا ربنا ولا تحمل علينا إصرا كما حملته على الذين من قبلنا ربنا ولا تحملنا ما لا طاقة لنا به واعف عنا واغفر لنا وارحمنا اللهم إنا نسألك إيمانا صادقا ويقينا دائما وعلما نافعا وقلبا خاشعا ونورا ساطعا ورزقا واسعا وشفاء من كل داء وغنيمة من كل بر ونجاة من كل إثم وتوبة من كل ذنب اللهم لا تدع لنا ذنبا إلا غفرته ولا عيبا إلا سترته ولا هما إلا فرجته ولا مريضا إلا شفيته ولا مبتلا إلا عافيته ولا أسيرا إلا فككته ولا مجاهدا في سبيلك إلا نصرته ولا حاجة هي لك رضا ولنا فيها صلاح إلا قضيتها يا كريم اللهم إنا نعوذ برضاك من سخطك وبعفوك من عقوبتك ونعوذ بك منك لا نحصي ثناء عليك أنت كما أثنيت على نفسك وصلى اللهم على محمد النبي الأمي وآله السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته جزاك الله خير إن شاء الله بارك الله فيك.
Thank you very much.
جزاك الله.
I'm the only one that can do this. Thank you, everybody. Thank you.